Chapter 2967. With such a judgment, the man-made worlds will side and stop the means that it had prepared to deal with the many worlds in Luo Fan's territory. In the vortex, which was also the manifestation of the man-made world's will, the situation in the gray simulation of chaos had begun to become clear. Although the advantage was not too great, Luo Fan's incarnation had indeed obtained a certain advantage. The man-made world's will was clearly unwilling to accept such a situation. Therefore, the man-made world's will that had focused its attention on Luo Fan's incarnation began to search for a way to break out of this disadvantage. As it began to ponder, various indescribable things began to appear in the gray existence. Some of these things were treasures, some were weapons, some were mountains, rivers, flowers, and trees. Some were simply some strange laws such as time and space, and so on. It was almost everything that a living being could imagine. This simulation of the state of primal chaos was all-inclusive and could even create heaven and earth. It was naturally not too special for such an existence to give birth to all these things. Once these things were born, they would naturally move towards the three-legged cauldron and use all sorts of means to influence and change the three-legged cauldron. Of course, most of these things did not have any effect. Even the sound waves around the three-legged cauldron could not break through it. Only some extremely special things, such as powerful treasures, could barely pass through the obstruction of space and really affect the three-legged cauldron. However, even such existences only stopped on the surface of the three-legged cauldron. They could not break into the three-legged cauldron at all, and they could not really affect the world inside the three-legged cauldron at all. They directly collapsed and turned into endless gray existences that merged into the surroundings and disappeared without a trace. However, this situation was not completely useless for the man-made world's will. For the man-made world's will, anything that could affect the three-legged cauldron would allow it to gain a deeper understanding of the three-legged cauldron. With a deeper understanding, it would naturally be able to think of more ways to deal with the three-legged cauldron. In any case, for this simulation that simulated the state of chaos, the changes were endless, and the probing that could appear was naturally endless as well. Furthermore, the number of times it could be tested was enough to make this man-made worlds will accept the slowest progress. Luo Fan naturally knew what the man-made world was thinking. However, he did not have any effective way to stop them from advancing slowly, like a panicked general trend. He could only use a monotonous method to resist the numerous things that were spawning from all directions and were constantly being thrown towards the three-legged round cauldron through various methods. The more monotonous the response, the more confused the other party would be, and the slower it would be for the other party to understand him. While dealing with the artificial world's will's probing, he also constantly accelerated the stacking and expansion of the surrounding sound waves. The stacking and expansion of the sound waves could impact the simulation of the chaotic state itself. If the progress was enough, it could even completely tear the simulation of the chaotic state apart. It could be said that for Luo Fan, he only needed to completely tear apart this simulation of the chaotic state before the other party fully understood him and grasped his weaknesses. The situation seemed to have fallen into a stalemate. Amidst this stalemate, the time that Luo Fan's embodiment since began to pass slowly. Unknowingly, 100,000 years had passed in the perception of Luo Fan's embodiment. At this point, in the simulation of the chaotic state, the sound waves around the three-legged round cauldron had already filled more than half of the simulation of the chaotic state. Of course, these space-times were still extremely chaotic and fragmented. It was obviously impossible to rely on these space-times as a foundation to develop anything. It could be said that even cultivators would not be able to avoid being harmed by these space-times, let alone develop further. However, the existence of these space-times was not useless. Due to the existence of these space-times, the laws in the three-legged round cauldron had unknowingly fused with most of the simulation of the chaotic state. This fusion wasn't very deep, and it was impossible for him to completely control this grayish existence. However, The existence of these laws had already allowed Luo Fan's embodiment to easily spread his perception to most of the gray existence around him. Furthermore, he had absolute confidence that he could completely destroy the simulation of the chaotic state within this range. Since the simulation of the chaotic state was a kind of simulation, it was naturally an extremely meticulous existence. As long as the corresponding disturbances were carried out, this simulation would fail. It was just like when a person wanted to go around a circle. As long as the trajectory was slightly disturbed, the circle would naturally not be able to take shape. It was the same for this kind of simulation. Since it was a simulation, it was naturally not a true chaotic state. In fact, it was not even a true simulation of the chaotic state. It was an extremely intricate method that used all sorts of extremely detailed and mysterious methods to stack the corresponding objects, such as time, space, matter, energy, laws, mysteries of the Great Tao, and so on, in a special way. It could be said that such a simulation might seem chaotic and random, but it was actually extremely precise. As long as such an existence was slightly disturbed, it would naturally be destroyed and lose its original nature. If he wanted to achieve this, he could already do it with the laws that had fused with most of the grayish existence around him. At the same time, the things that were spawned from the grayish existence in the surroundings also had an absolute target. Now, the things that were derived from the gray existence were no longer all kinds of strange things, nor were they indescribable attacks. Instead, they were magic treasures. Each of them looked completely different and had all kinds of strange effects, but they were all extremely high-level magic treasures. These magic treasures were continuously born in the surrounding gray existence, and then, like rivers flowing into the sea, they continuously gathered towards the three-legged round cauldron in the center. During this process, they constantly destroyed time and space, constantly pushed away the gray existence, and even caused all kinds of strange changes in the gray existence. They were either grand or extremely obscure as they smashed onto the three-legged round cauldron. After 100,000 years of adjustment, the magic treasures that were created by the man-made worlds while controlling the gray existence were clearly no longer like in the beginning, where they couldn't even break through the sound waves and space-time. However, the effects of these magic treasures smashing onto the three-legged round cauldron were all different. Some magic treasures were completely destroyed the moment they came into contact with the three-legged round cauldron, turning into countless fragments that were devoured by the gray existence in the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. Some even penetrated the surface of the three-legged round cauldron, causing ripples on the cauldron, causing explosions, or directly piercing into it, causing all sorts of movements within it. However, no matter what kind of magic treasures they were all destroyed by the three-legged round cauldron, returning to the gray existence in the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. Evidently, although these magic treasures were much more powerful than the magic treasures from before, they were still unable to truly harm the three-legged round cauldron, much less harm Luo Fan, who was within it. At this moment, outside the gray existence, the colorful vortex had already shrunk to a 10,000th of its original size. Objectively speaking, this size was still incomparably huge, and the area it occupied was incomparably vast, but compared to the scale of the past, it was already much, much smaller. After being shrunk by so many times, the vortex could no longer be seen at this moment. Instead, it seemed so real, as if it was even more real than the real world and everything in it. Such a vortex constantly rotated in the void, constantly shrinking, and indescribable intense constantly flickered on it. Every flicker of intense would cause various changes in space-time, causing the endless laws to be changed. Of course, while the upper echelons had fallen into a stalemate that did not change much in the past 100,000 years, the situation at the lower echelons was clearly not as stable. Over the years, the world that belonged to Luo Fan and the world that belonged to the worlds will have been constantly attacking each other. Whether it was the world that belonged to Luo Fan or the world that belonged to the worlds will, They completely treated each other as enemies after learning of each other's existence. They did their best to use all sorts of methods to eliminate the other party's influence on them. As a result, the war was naturally extremely intense. In such a war, it was not the world on the world's will side that had the upper hand. Instead, it was the world on Luo Fan's side that had a relatively smaller range. The reason for this was actually very simple. It was because in terms of the quality of the world itself, the world on Luo Fan's side was superior. After all, the world on Luo Fan's side had developed for more than 1,000,000 years compared to the world on the world's will side. The foundation that had been accumulated for more than 1,000,000 years was not that easy to surpass. Of course, even if it was superior compared to the overall scale, the gains from Luo Fan's side were also limited. At the very least, compared to the overall scale, the gains were rather limited. Hence, over the past 100,000 years, the hole in the space-time where the worlds will resided was almost no different from before. It looked exactly the same as it had been at the beginning. From this, it could be seen that the judgment of the man-made worlds was extremely accurate. The situation at the bottom did not have a decisive effect on the overall situation of the war. The true deciding factor was the outcome of the war between the upper echelons, Luo Fan's incarnation and the man-made world's will. On this day, the man-made worlds will suddenly surged. Immediately after, the space-time within the area it covered started to tremble violently. This great world was a boundless ocean. The countless explorations that had been opened up as the territories of the participating parties were like islands dotting this boundless ocean. Because of this boundless ocean was also called the realm sea by the living beings in the world. And at this time, because of the trembling of the man-made world's will, it was the boundless realm sea that was surging. As the realm sea surged, the entire great world that was originally considered orderly seemed to have fallen into doomsday and started to become chaotic. The impact of this change on the boundless world above the ocean was even more self-evident. These worlds were completely like leaves drifting on the sea surface, floating above the endless world sea. Now that the realm sea started to surge endlessly to these worlds, it was naturally like there was an invisible hand grabbing those worlds and starting to shake violently. This change instantly cut off the connection between many worlds. At the very least, it was the connection between the cultivators of those worlds. Even if it was a tribulation entering Powerhouse, facing this kind of tremor, they would need to be careful and cautious at this time and could not come and go as they pleased like before. Under this kind of change, the cooperation between the many worlds was naturally completely severed. The impact of this on Luo Fan's side was even greater. After all, the cooperation between the world's will and the worlds was actually not driven by the cultivators of those worlds. The result of their cooperation was actually the man-made worlds that was causing this kind of tremor at this moment. And this kind of cooperation, at this time, would not be affected by this kind of tremor. In contrast, the cooperation between the many worlds on Luo Fan's side was completely carried out within the framework that Luo Fan's incarnation had set up back then. This kind of cooperation, no matter how lofty the framework was, could not be changed. It was actually a cooperation pushed by the cultivators of those worlds. Chapter 2968. The cooperation between the many worlds in Luo Fan's territory was completely destroyed. The countless worlds could only go their own way, and the overall power of the world was naturally weakened countless times. The battles between the cultivators in this world came to a complete halt. After all, without the connection between the worlds, the cultivators in Luo Fan's territory could not even cross over, let alone attack other territories. At this moment, the focus of the man-made worlds was clearly not the situation of these worlds. Its goal was still the interior, the more three-legged cauldron and Luo Fan's incarnation in the grayish existence. At this moment, the grayish existence underwent a huge change. Continuous destruction began to appear at the edges of the grayish existence, and it continued to spread towards the center. In this process of destruction, incredible destructive power was constantly released, spreading in the direction of the sound wave spacetime in the center. With this change, the vortex that the man-made worlds will manifested also began to produce inexplicable chaos. Obviously, although this destruction was caused by the man-made world's will, it was not unaffected by this destruction. It also needed to resist the destructive power produced by the destruction. In the grayish existence, time was also an attribute that had been confused. Therefore, time didn't mean much to that hazy existence. At this moment, the destruction had already swept through the entire grayish existence, and it even spread to the past of the space-time, the three-legged cauldron, and attacked them. Facing this situation, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. "Looks like I can't wait any longer." This thought emerged in his mind. With this thought, the three-legged cauldron changed. The originally extremely stable three-legged cauldron collapsed at this moment, and it once again turned into a wild world. It began to frantically devour the surrounding space-time, and as it devoured, it continued to expand. In the process of this expansion, a powerful impact that simulated the surrounding chaotic state began to appear. Under this impact, the entire grayish existence was quickly torn apart. When this grayish existence was complete, it had a powerful sealing effect on the barrier between the planes. However, at this moment, this sealing effect was naturally shattered by the destructive force that was produced from the outside in and from the inside out. As this seal was broken, Luo Fan's avatar clearly felt that his connection with the other planes had finally been restored. The moment he realized that this connection had been restored, Luo Fan's incarnation did not hesitate to use the dimensional division technique. The first thing to be split was none other than the world formed by the three-legged cauldron. In the blink of an eye, this region had already been divided into countless layers of attributes, and they were all absorbed into the dimensions that were formed from the power of the other layers. As the world was divided into countless layers of attributes, the surrounding grayish existences were also quickly divided. The reason why the grayish existence had such power was because time, space, matter, energy, laws, and everything else were mixed together in a way that simulated the chaotic state. In this way, when everything was divided by the countless dimensions, the power of the grayish existence naturally disappeared without a trace. Even with the support of the man-made world's will, these attributes still had considerable power in the corresponding dimensions. However, in the face of the attributes of the world controlled by Luo Fan, they still did not have much power to resist. In the blink of an eye, they were completely destroyed, devoured, and disappeared without a trace by the world formed by the three-legged cauldron. As more and more grayish existences were destroyed, the destruction formed by the man-made worlds will naturally become weaker. The destructive power produced by this kind of destruction also became weaker and weaker. In the end, it could no longer withstand the destruction from the inside out, and the entire grayish existence was finally torn to shreds. When the grayish existence was completely torn to shreds, only the world formed by Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron, which had been divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimensions, was left in its place. At this moment, the man-made worlds will continue to spread outwards, constantly spreading towards the main body of the vortex formed by the man-made world's will. It continued to divide the main body of the vortex into countless layers of attributes. At this moment, the man-made worlds will let out an extremely furious roar. Come on, let us truly decide the victor. Amidst this roar, the entire great world began to tremble violently. Endless energy, power, and laws began to frantically gather towards the man-made worlds from all over the world. In the process of gathering, the karma of war also began to materialize. In the void, it was like an incomparably huge network, directly enveloping the entire world. The gathering of the world's energy, power, and laws caused the huge palm network to shake violently, causing it to constantly distort and even show signs of shattering. During this process, the vortex formed by the man-made worlds will also begin to undergo drastic changes. The distortion was only the most basic. Apart from the distortions, there were also shattering and explosions happening one after another. Evidently, the gathering of energy, power, and laws did not cause the man-made worlds any harm. At this moment, the space and time where the worlds resided appeared out of thin air above the void. Through the hole in the space and time where the worlds resided, it could be seen that the vortex seemed to be spinning faster and faster, and some sort of indescribable distortion even began to appear in the vortex. Is this your purpose? At this time, Luo Fan's figure appeared in front of the hole, and he said these words. The vortex did not reply and merely continued to squirm faster. Evidently, it did not feel that there was a need to reply to Luo Fan's question. Back then, it seemed that you were the first to have the idea of condensing the karma of war. Now, it's actually you who wants to get rid of the karma of war. How fickle. Luo Fan did not have the slightest intention of remaining silent at this moment, and continued speaking. The situation is different, so the choice will naturally be different. The worlds finally spoke at this moment. At this moment, the huge network that had materialized in the void had completely deformed. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly feel that the restrictions that the karma of war had on him were no longer as stable as before. Some of the restrictions that were originally weaker had suddenly become extremely strong. Some of the restrictions that were originally very strong had suddenly weakened. For example, the restrictions that originally prevented the two parties from attacking each other had already been greatly weakened. At this moment, an incredible light suddenly erupted from the space and time where the worlds resided. It was like a sharp arrow that pierced through the void and landed on Luo Fan. Clang! A loud sound came from Luo Fan's body at this moment. Immediately after, Luo Fan's body collapsed under the bombardment of the golden light and turned into a cloud-like existence that began to tumble endlessly in the void. That clump of clouds was so mystical that even if it seemed to have been shattered by the golden radiance, it still gave off a mystical charm that transcended everything. It felt as though it had descended from a high and mighty place. The Luo Fan that had appeared here was naturally not Luo Fan's original body. His original body was still within the power related to the true sage and was still researching the memories of the world's will's predecessor. At this moment, the one that had appeared here was just his clone. Although it was not an ordinary clone, it was a clone that had been condensed with the help of a trace of power related to the true sage. Now that he knew what kind of existence Luo Fan was, he could naturally understand what was going on with the changes happening here at this time. Clearly, although this clone of Luo Fan had been shattered by the attack released by the world's will, it was not enough to damage the material used to construct the clone. However, because the material used to construct the clone was too high level, even if the attack was enough to shatter it, it was not enough to damage the material used to construct the clone. At this moment, the cloud that had appeared here was the form of the trace of power related to the true sage. Although the golden light continued to crush the cloud and wanted to completely destroy it, it could only return in vain in the end. It could only watch as the cloud squirmed and churned continuously. Faced with such a situation, the worlds made a prompt decision and gave up on targeting the cloud. Instead, it gathered endless light again and brought along the golden light that had previously destroyed Luo Fan's clone. With a change of direction, it crossed space-time and landed on Luo Fan's world of laws. This time, the light unleashed the power of the world's will to the fullest. Although it was just a light, it had a terrifying power that could destroy the universe and collapse chaos. In the face of such might, even this great world began to crumble inch by inch. The amount of space-time that the light traveled was the same amount of space-time that was completely destroyed. The distance that the light traveled was the same amount of space-time that was completely shattered. In the end, the light seemed to not need to experience time at all, as it directly landed on the world of laws and smashed fiercely towards the world. The size of the worlds was so huge that one could imagine how astonishing the scale of the light it emitted was. At that very moment, even though there was only a single ray of light, it covered the entire sky and earth. It felt as if the entire world had been transformed into that ray of light and was drowned by it. Such a scale not only completely covered the entire size of the world of laws, but it even far exceeded it. It directly covered a vast area around the world of laws and enveloped billions of worlds within this light. At this moment, the war karma suddenly trembled, and the huge network that covered the entire great world suddenly froze. As it froze, the various powers of the war karma suddenly came into play again for a short period of time. Immediately afterward, the golden light suddenly turned illusory, like ordinary light and shadow, no longer able to cause any damage to things related to Luo Fan. Although it smashed fiercely onto Luo Fan's world of laws and the countless worlds around it, it didn't affect these worlds in the slightest. After the light passed, everything was no different from how it was at the beginning, as if nothing had happened. Damn it! At this moment, a furious roar came from the space-time where the worlds will resided. At this moment, the entire huge war karma network completely shattered. The originally perfect network turned into countless fragments in the blink of an eye, turning into countless tiny light spots that illuminated the entire world. Obviously, the instantaneous change just now was the final radiance of the war karma. At this moment, the final radiance of the setting sun passed, and the war karma finally couldn't be maintained anymore and completely collapsed. There's a price to pay for flipping the table. At this moment, the clone of Luo Fan that was shattered by the light suddenly condensed again and said. Soon after, the endless specks of light formed by the destruction of the war karma began to rapidly gather towards the clone. The clone seemed to have turned into an incomparably huge black hole and began to frantically devour the endless specks of light. As the devouring continued, the aura of the clone began to strengthen endlessly. Very quickly, the clone began to emit the characteristics of perfection. Clearly, it had reached the limit of the simulation of chaos. But even at this stage, the convergence of the light spots still didn't stop, and the aura of the clone was still endlessly strengthening. That perfection seemed to be gradually distorted during the strengthening process, and there were faint signs of it shattering. At this moment, at the location where the man-made worlds was located, a massive world had completely replaced the position of the man-made world's will, covering the entire sky. Chapter 2969. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone felt that he had become billions of times more powerful than he had been before. It felt as if he had become an ant among ants just a moment ago. Under such a powerful feeling, the great world formed by the tribulation levels seemed to be in his palm at this moment. With a slight movement of his body, crackling sound were transmitted from his body in all directions, causing the void to continuously shatter. One could even vaguely see a pitch-black simulated state of chaos through the cracks after the shattering. As for the space-time where the will of the world resided, it seemed extremely fragile in front of him, as if it was just a piece of paper. He only needed to exert a little bit of force to tear it apart. The feeling was so strange that he could not help but want to give it a try. At that moment, the hole in the space-time where the will of the world resided was closing at an unimaginable speed. Originally, the reason why the hole could not be closed was because of the karmic shackles of war, as well as the runes that Luo Fan had inserted long ago. Now that the karmic shackles of war had collapsed, the shackles on the hole were no longer effective. Although the runes that Luo Fan had inserted long ago had some effect, they were clearly unable to keep up with the size of the hole. That was why the hole was rapidly mending due to the will of heaven and earth. However, even though the healing speed was unimaginably fast, the scale of the process was simply too huge. Therefore, even with the unimaginable healing speed, it would still take a long time for it to completely close. At that moment, Luo Fan's clone's eyes shone with a strange light as he inserted it into the hole. As the light pierced in, the hole suddenly collapsed. In the blink of an eye, it had expanded to a size that was several times larger than it was at the beginning. The method that the worlds will use to close the hole had completely failed. At that moment, an extremely furious roar came from the world's will. Don't even think about it. Along with the roar, the space-time where the worlds will resided trembled violently, and the entire space-time gradually began to emit an indescribable golden light. The golden light continued to grow stronger, gradually enveloping the entire world below it. Then, the golden light began to flicker and condense. Finally, it condensed into a huge human figure, which raised its hand and slapped at Luo Fan's doppelganger. With that slap, the void stirred, worlds were born, and heaven and earth were born. It was just a slap, but there seemed to be countless worlds being born and destroyed in an instant. In the face of such a slap, even Luo Fan's clone felt like it had become extremely small. It was as if it was going to be completely devoured by the space-time, heaven, and earth in the slap, and easily erased. However, it was obvious that such a thing would not happen. Even if Luo Fan's clone had not absorbed the countless light spots that dissipated after the collapse of the karma of war, it would not have been so fragile. Not to mention that he had absorbed those light fragments and had become many times more powerful than before. At this moment, his body trembled slightly, and he had already broken free from this spiritual attack. Then, he did not even need to move. His gaze narrowed slightly, and the golden light that had torn open the hole quickly condensed at this moment. In just an instant, it turned into a sharp blade and ruthlessly stabbed into the human figure's palm. There was no special method, but the endless heaven and earth, endless world, and endless space-time on the palm completely collapsed. Along with the collapse, the human figure's palm, wrist, forearm, arm, shoulder, and even the entire body connected to the palm also collapsed. In the end, the human figure completely disappeared, leaving only the gaze of Luo Fan's clone as before. It continued to advance for where the human figure originally was, penetrating all obstacles and ruthlessly stabbing into the space-time where the worlds will resided, charging straight towards the vortex. As the gaze entered the space-time where the worlds will resided, the space-time began to collapse rapidly. This time, the collapse was not just a small-scale one. It was a large-scale one that directly spread throughout the entire space-time. In other words, it was the kind of collapse above the entire world's void. In just an instant, the sky seemed to have been completely shattered. Endless cracks filled the entire sky. Then, the cracks continued to grow. In the end, with an earth-shattering roar, the sky completely collapsed. As the sky collapsed, an unimaginable force descended from the sky, violently sweeping across everything in this part of the world. The realm sea that supported the endless world, which was also the ocean that occupied the absolute majority of this great world, not only did it surge under this impact, but it also continuously shattered and collapsed. It was as if countless holes had appeared in the void, and the seawater was frantically sucked into them. This kind of chaos affected the many worlds, and it was as if the sky and earth were falling apart. In just an instant, the countless worlds that had been strung together by various means, including the worlds in Luo Fan's territory and the world's will's territory, became completely chaotic. Countless worlds were also devoured into the void along with the ocean, disappearing without a trace. It could be said that the number of worlds that had disappeared and the number of lives that had died was in the trillions. At this moment, behind the shattering sky, an incomparably huge vortex that enveloped every inch of the void appeared behind the sky. In other words, it replaced the original sky of this world and became the new sky of this world. However, at this moment, the sky wasn't stable either. A golden light penetrated the main body of the vortex and began to infect the entire vortex along with the rotation of the vortex. Gradually, the entire vortex was dyed gold. How can it be so strong? A voice came from a vortex. Obviously, this vortex was the world's will. At this moment, the golden light that was inserted into the vortex was the gaze of Luo Fan's clone. At this moment, the gaze had already pierced into the main body of the vortex and began to spread along the main body. The parts of the vortex that had turned into gold seemed to be shackled and gradually broke away from the control of the world's will. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone only sneered and grabbed downwards. A huge palm appeared out of thin air above the world formed by the three-legged cauldron and slightly shrank towards the huge world. In just a moment, the huge world rapidly shrank, and in the blink of an eye, it had turned back into the three-legged cauldron and lay quietly in the palm. Immediately after, the palm shrank upwards, and the three-legged cauldron fell directly into the hand of Luo Fan's clone. I didn't expect the biggest gain to be this magic treasure. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone showed an inexplicable expression. At this moment, the perfection that was bestowed upon him by the simulated primal chaos state had been scattered all over the place. However, after this perfect characteristic was washed away, the aura on his body and his strength had already far surpassed that of a perfect seventh tribulation powerhouse. Of course, his realm was still at the peak of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. The terrifying strength that came from the same realm was like someone who had always been in the chi refinement realm, but had reached thousands of layers of chi refinement. The reason why he could obtain this strength was actually very simple. It was because of the final gift of the karma of war. The karma of war itself did not have a consciousness. It would not bestow any existence after it collapsed because of any thoughts or thoughts. However, as an existence that could even control this great world and ultimately restrict the world's will to follow the rules set by it, the karma of war clearly did not lack spirituality. This spirituality was not thought or will. It could not be communicated or negotiated. However, it would instinctively choose to punish the existence that caused it to collapse. And clearly, in the process of the collapse of the karma of war, the initiator was clearly more powerful than the world's will at that time. Therefore, the spirituality of the karma of war naturally chose to strengthen Luo Fan, who was hostile to the world's will, and use Luo Fan's hand to inflict punishment on the world's will. Of course, if one were to say that Luo Fan's backup plan didn't play a role, no one would believe it. This was not because Luo Fan had long expected this to happen. Instead, during the process of constructing the karma of war, he had tried his best to distort the spirituality of the karma of war so that it would have a better impression of him than the other two. This distortion did not have much effect before. After all, the rules of the karma of war were stricter. Even if the spirituality leaned towards one side, it would not help that side cheat. However, the moment the karma of war collapsed, this distortion could obviously greatly affect the judgment of the karma of war. Not to mention that only Luo Fan and the worlds were left in this world. Even if the worlds will still existed, there would still be three sides here. Under the distortion of the spirituality, the karma of war would definitely choose Luo Fan as the carrier of its final gift. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. An avatar rushed out of the three-legged cauldron and rushed into the avatar in a flash. As the avatar merged with the avatar felt that it had become more stable. The power that the avatar possessed was a terrifying strength that was hundreds of trillions of times stronger than that of an ordinary peak seventh tribulation powerhouse. This strength clearly far exceeded the limits that a seventh tribulation powerhouse could control with his cultivation realm. The reason why there were no problems before was clearly because of the final gift of the karma of war. Now, with the fusion of the avatar, although Luo Fan's cultivation realm did not increase, it could make his body much larger. This increase in body size naturally allowed Luo Fan to control more power. And the effect of this increase in control was that the power that Luo Fan's avatar controlled became more stable. It would not be like before, where it seemed like it could explode at any time. It still can't last long. With this thought in mind, he waved his other hand, and another three-legged cauldron appeared. Immediately after, he touched the two three-legged cauldrons in his hands to the center. With a loud cracking sound, the two three-legged cauldrons collapsed at the same time. In the end, they turned into a vortex that began to spin in circles at the location where they collapsed. A tendency to condense appeared above the vortex, but at the same time, an inexplicable repulsive force appeared at the center of the vortex. Seeing this, Luo Fan only let out a soft cry, "Condense." Along with this soft cry, the vortex suddenly became sluggish. Immediately after, an unimaginable force began to press towards the center from all directions. In the blink of an eye, the outline of a three-legged cauldron was formed at the center of the vortex. Moreover, the outline of the three-legged cauldron continued to attack and solidify as time passed. Not long after, it had completely taken shape and no longer seemed illusory. As for the vortex, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. Clearly, the vortex had completely turned into the three-legged cauldron. Or rather, the two three-legged cauldrons had completely fused into one under the means of Luo Fan's avatar. As the three-legged cauldron took shape, Luo Fan's avatar's body trembled slightly. Countless light spots began to continuously spread from his body. Clearly, the War Karma's gift was starting to be difficult to maintain and was gradually collapsing. Why did Luo Fan not take advantage of the War Karma's gift to deal with the world's will before it collapsed? Why did he waste time to fuse the two three-legged cauldrons into one? It was all for the sake of this moment. Therefore, at this moment, he did not hesitate and forcibly controlled the countless light spots to gather towards the three-legged cauldron. Chapter 2970. As these specks of light integrated, the aura of the three-legged cauldron began to strengthen continuously. The perfect characteristic that originally filled the three-legged cauldron, which had already reached the limits of the simulated chaotic state, also began to distort continuously. Clearly, the three-legged cauldron was about to break through the perfect state just like Luo Fan's clone, as specks of light constantly escaped from Luo Fan's clone and were absorbed by the three-legged cauldron. The aura of the three-legged cauldron also began to strengthen continuously. The perfect characteristic was gradually scattered and could no longer be called a perfect characteristic. At the same time, the aura of Luo Fan's clone also began to fall bit by bit. It was as if his power, strength, and might had dissipated along with the dissipation of those specks of light. At this moment, an earth-shattering roar came from the huge vortex in the sky. As the roar echoed, incredible power erupted from the vortex, which was already riddled with countless cracks. After the power erupted, it gathered rapidly towards the location of Luo Fan's clone. In the blink of an eye, it had already penetrated the endless obstacles and penetrated the body of Luo Fan's clone. This power was so terrifying that even heaven and earth were as fragile as a piece of paper in front of it. Wherever the power passed, time and space collapsed. Laws and laws were broken, heaven and earth were overturned, and the universe was destroyed. Everything seemed to have been completely destroyed. Under this power, the void of this entire world seemed to have been turned into endless fragments. However, they still stuck together, barely forming the void and barely maintaining the general outline of this world. This scene, combined with the endless surging of the ocean below and the shocking chaos, made the entire world seem as if it had been turned upside down. The scene was so horrifying that any living being that could see this scene would be filled with fear and shock. This impact even affected the world of laws in Luo Fan's territory. At this moment, even the world of laws found it hard to remain stable under this influence. It was as if there were invisible hands grabbing onto every part of the world of laws and rubbing it continuously. Even with the power related to the true saints suppressing everything, countless cracks had appeared in this world and countless disasters had occurred. Although the scenery inside was slightly better than that of the great world outside at this moment, it was still far more beautiful. However, there was a limit to it. No matter how difficult it was still a tribulation that was impossible to resist for the living beings of the world. In just a short period of time, billions and trillions of living beings in the world of laws had died. They had been completely annihilated by the sudden disaster. Of course, this world was different from the great world outside. The creator and ruler of this world of laws was Luo Fan, and Luo Fan's true body was still controlling and maintaining everything in this world of laws. In this way, even if so many living beings died, Luo Fan would only need a single thought to preserve the life essence of those countless living beings. Through various means, he would be able to reincarnate, revive, or even directly resurrect them. In contrast, the situation in this great world was completely different. Although the world will of this great world still existed, it was obvious that the world will could no longer take care of itself at this time. With Luo Fan's clone standing opposite him, even if the will of the world wanted to split a strand of its will to protect the living beings in this region, it was impossible for it to do so. Therefore, even if the will of the world still existed, the billions and trillions of living beings in this great world would really die if they died. There would be no chance for them to start over again. At this moment, after withstanding the terrifying power of the world will, the light spots that were dispersing from Luo Fan's clone didn't speed up. On the contrary, because of the bombardment of the power, the speed at which the light spots were dispersing actually started to slow down. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the arrival of the power had stimulated the remnant spirituality of the war karma. The spirituality was extremely hostile towards the world that broke the war karma. As the power of the world will continued to gather, it made the spirituality instinctively want to go against it. The desire to go against the world had naturally stimulated the remnant power of the war karma, causing the speed at which the spirituality was dispersing to slow down. The power gathered by the will of the heavens and earth could easily destroy the world. The power was so terrifying that the space and time that the power passed through was completely destroyed. It was so much so that the entire world felt as if it had shattered into countless fragments. However, those fragments still maintained their original positions and did not completely collapse. At this moment, if the power that gathered on Luo Fan's clone was placed in any other world, even if it was a great world that far surpassed a perfect world, it would be enough to completely destroy and erase the world. However, at this moment, when the power gathered on Luo Fan's clone, it had already been completely annihilated by the remnant power of the war karma that existed in his body. Luo Fan's clone was still as calm as before, and there was not even the slightest sign of it being attacked. This scene made the world will's body tense up. At this moment, it suddenly regretted its actions of creating the war karma. If it had not created the war karma, it would have been a little troublesome to face Luo Fan, and it would also be in danger of being completely suppressed by the power related to a true divine. However, at least it had the initiative. As long as it was careful, it would not be a problem for it to last for a long time. It would not be like now. If it did not destroy the war karma, it would be completely annihilated by the war karma. And after destroying the war karma, the remnant power would be completely hostile towards it. It would pour all its power onto its enemy, which would also be going against it. However, it was clear that even the world could not change what it had done. At this time, he could only watch as the karmic power of war exerted a stronger and stronger effect on Luo Fan's clone. Luo Fan's doppelganger held the three-legged round cauldron and took the initiative to pour endless energy into the three-legged round cauldron, trying its best to enhance the three-legged round cauldron's power and essence. Compared to the endurance of Luo Fan's clone, the three-legged cauldron was much stronger. There was a difference between magic treasures and living beings. Even if the material of Luo Fan's clone was the power related to a true divine, and the material of the three-legged cauldron was slightly weaker than that power, it was still the same. Living beings had a consciousness, but they had to worry about many things. Their power could not completely fill the material, and they could not reach the limit that the material could contain. However, magic treasures were different. Because they were magic treasures, they did not need to worry about anything. Naturally, they could use the material to its limit. And the materials of the two clearly contained some power related to a true divine. Needless to say, Luo Fan's clone was formed by a strand of the power related to a true divine. The power that it possessed was naturally extremely pure. Although the three-legged cauldron did not have the same structure, it was obvious that it was formed by two three-legged cauldrons. Among them, the three-legged cauldron formed by Luo Fan's clone was formed by a strand of the power related to a true divine that was separated from the body of the clone. And this three-legged cauldron was a part of the current three-legged cauldron. From this, it was obvious that the three-legged cauldron in the hands of Luo Fan's clone also possessed a little power related to a true divine. Although it was only an insignificant strand, it was still a power related to a true divine. Even if it was an insignificant strand, it was enough to strengthen the three-legged cauldron's endurance to an unbelievable level. At this moment, such a powerful endurance was enough for the three-legged cauldron to completely absorb the remaining power from the collapse of the karma of the war, thus pushing the level of the three-legged cauldron to an unbelievable level. From a certain perspective, a living being's will was clearly a huge weakness for a living being. In terms of the material itself, the endurance of Luo Fan's clone was definitely thousands of times stronger than that of the three-legged cauldron. However, because of the existence of Luo Fan's will, it could not even unleash a 10 millionth of its potential. Its endurance was far inferior to that of the three-legged cauldron. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally could not think too much about it. At this moment, he merely channeled the power that could only stay in his body for a short period of time into the three-legged cauldron. He continued to fuse with the three-legged cauldron and continuously improve the nature of this treasure. He wanted to increase the power of this treasure as much as possible. After such a transformation, the power that could only stay in his body for a short period of time was now kept by him in another form. This process seemed unbelievable, but it was actually very common. It was like an ordinary person borrowing money to invest. The borrowed money naturally did not belong to that person, and it could only stay by his side for a limited period of time. However, the money earned from the investment could obviously not be taken away by anyone, as long as he could pay off the debt. At this moment, to Luo Fan's clone, the remaining power from the karma of the war that had fused into his body was like borrowed money. Refining and improving the three-legged cauldron was equivalent to using the borrowed money to invest, and it was an investment with an extremely shocking return. The will of the universe was naturally very clear about what Luo Fan was doing. At this moment, he knew that he had already lost. At the very least, he had already lost in this world. At this moment, the best thing he could do was, of course, to interrupt the plan of Luo Fan's clone, so that Luo Fan could not transform the form of the karma of the war into the three-legged cauldron. However, it was obvious that the karma of the war had not dissipated yet. No matter what he did to Luo Fan's clone, it could only stay for a longer period of time. In the end, the karma of the war would only stay for a longer period of time so that it would have more time to integrate into the three-legged cauldron. Under such circumstances, although he had the only correct and effective way to deal with Luo Fan's actions, in the end, all he could do was wait. Wait for the karma of the war to dissipate completely. Wait for Luo Fan's clone to integrate most of the power into the three-legged cauldron. If he was facing other existences, he could still gamble on the efficiency of integrating the power into the three-legged cauldron and whether the remaining power would be strong enough to threaten him. However, he was facing Luo Fan at this moment, an existence that could even trigger this great calamity and even facilitate his birth. Even if there were no flaws, such an existence would create a flaw, and even if there were no opportunities, he would create an opportunity. Now, the residual power of the war karma was here, and the three-legged cauldron was also here. All he had to do was transfer the residual power of the war karma into the three-legged cauldron. How could the efficiency be low? According to the prediction of the will of the universe, even if Luo Fan performed poorly, the three-legged cauldron would definitely be able to retain at least 80% of the karma of the war in the three-legged cauldron. As long as the cauldron could retain 80% of the karma of the war, it would be more than enough to deal with him. Therefore, to the will of the universe in this great world, his fate was already determined. Next, he could at most delay for a little more time. It was already impossible for him to turn defeat into victory. With a judgment in its heart, the the will of the universe finally made up its mind. Of course, it was impossible for it to completely admit defeat. Although this world seemed to be so vast and great, it was ultimately only a part of the world that was simulated in the state of chaos. It could not represent the entire state of chaos. Chapter 2971. After making up its mind, the will of heaven and earth naturally didn't delay any further. Immediately, it began to control all the power in this world without any scruples. In the blink of an eye, every inch of the void in this world began to tremble. As it trembled, endless strange light began to emerge from the depths of the void like a boundless sea of mixed light. This sea of mixed light began to surge according to the will of heaven and earth. During the process of surging, the whole world that could still be maintained began to collapse. Everywhere in the void, time and space collapsed, and the laws were destroyed. Everything in the universe was constantly dying. An indescribable aura of destruction gradually permeated the entire world. As the sea of light gradually churned, it gradually formed a vortex that became more and more obvious, with Luo Fan's world of laws as the center. At this point, it was obvious that the will of heaven and earth no longer cared about the possible counterattack of the power related to the true sage. For the current him, even the destruction of this incarnation was already an acceptable result. Under such circumstances, it naturally wouldn't entangle itself with Luo Fan's incarnation anymore. Naturally, it would attack Luo Fan's main body. This incomparably huge vortex was formed, and endless power began to gather towards Luo Fan's world of laws. It began to grind the world of laws like a huge millstone. In just an instant, Luo Fan's world of laws stopped distorting. Instead, it was replaced by an indescribable tremor. It was a tremor that went deep into the depths of the world of laws. This tremor carried a kind of aura of destruction, and it gradually filled every inch of the void in this world. Is this a life and death struggle? At this moment, Luo Fan's true body had an epiphany. Such a powerful aura of destruction could only appear when the entire great world outside was exerting its power towards his world of laws. Since the will of the heavens and earth dared to act in this way, it clearly didn't care about any counterattack that might appear in this world. Naturally, it wouldn't care if it would perish together with the will of the heavens and earth. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan naturally knew what to do. At this moment, Luo Fan's doppelganger, who was directly facing the will of the heavens and earth, raised his hand without hesitation and smashed the three-legged cauldron towards the huge vortex above. Boom, boom, boom. Earth-shattering explosions continued to erupt around the three-legged cauldron. The three-legged cauldron's power had already reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, it was constantly devouring the remnant power of the karma of war that Luo Fan had injected into it. Its level could be said to be rising with every passing moment. Such an existence had directly smashed into the body of the will of the heavens and earth. The impact of that was self-evident. At this moment, the unimaginable suppressive power endlessly poured towards the surrounding vortex, constantly annihilating and obliterating the body of the vortex. Gradually, a larger and larger hole began to appear in the place where the vortex was smashed. At this moment, the endless power released by this great world had already worn away a circle of the heavens and earth. At this moment, the outermost layer of the heavens and earth had already begun to collapse under the endless power of the heavens and earth. Although this collapse seemed to be only a small circle missing from the outside. In fact, this small circle already represented the countless parallel existences of this heavens and earth. It could be said that the possibility of the heavens and earth had been reduced by more than a few times with just this wear and tear. The destructive power of this wear and tear was self-evident. However, in the face of such a situation, Luo Fan's true body didn't take any special actions. He didn't agitate the power related to the true sage, nor did he use his light of the heavens and earth to resist the wear and tear of the power and power. Instead, he focused all his attention on controlling the clone, constantly manipulating the clone to destroy the main body of the heavens and earth's will. The reason why he made such a choice was because he clearly knew that even at this point, this great heavens and earth seemed to have come to an end. It seemed as if it would collapse and disappear in the next moment. However, the size of this heavens and earth was still there. Even if Luo Fan's heavens and earth was vast, and high level, it was still far from being comparable to this great heavens and earth that was on the verge of collapse. In this way, if the battlefield was placed on this heavens and earth, even if he exerted the power he could control to the limit, the final result would be that he could only watch the heavens and earth be completely worn away and destroyed by the endless power outside. In the end, the power related to the true sage would directly face all the power of this great heavens and earth. Such a result would obviously make all of Luo Fan's efforts go up in smoke. In contrast, it would be better to completely ignore the attacks on this heavens and earth and focus on using the clone to attack the main body of the heavens and earth's will. In this way, the destruction of this heavens and earth would be faster. However, in the end, it would also be the power related to the town that faced the endless power gathered by the great heavens and earth. It wasn't much different from before. On the other hand, the clone that had gathered the residual power of the war karma could play a great role. Perhaps it could completely destroy the main body of the heavens and earth before the heavens and earth was completely destroyed. In that case, without the control of the main body, the power of this great heavens and earth would naturally be unable to target the heavens and earth as it was now. It could be said that controlling the clone to directly attack the heavens and earths was the only correct choice for Luo Fan at this time. At this time, the three-legged cauldron was constantly wreaking havoc in the huge vortex under Luo Fan's control. Endless suppressive power, along with the means of dimensional division, continued to penetrate the main body of the vortex. At the same time, the residual power of the war karma in Luo Fan's body was also constantly pouring into the three-legged cauldron. With the infusion of this power, the suppressive power released by the three-legged cauldron not only became stronger and stronger, but the range it could affect also became wider and wider. Originally, the range that the three-legged cauldron could affect was only an area that was calculated in trillions of light years. If one were to use the heavens and earth as an analogy, it would only be equivalent to the vast area of the current heavens and earth. However, with the continuous infusion of the residual power of the war karma, the range of the suppressive power began to expand at a speed visible to the naked eye. One side of the heavens and earth, two sides of the heavens and earth, three sides of the heavens and earth. In just a few dozen breaths, it had already expanded to the vast area of 10,000 heavens and earth. Although this was still not considered large compared to the entire huge vortex, it was no longer insignificant. Compared to using power to directly suppress it, using one's body to wear it down from the depths was obviously more thorough, but it was also slower. Originally, Luo Fan's clone could easily affect the entire heavens and earth with the support of the residual power of the war karma. It could even completely destroy the space-time where the heavens and earth resided. However, the three-legged cauldron that had obtained the residual power of the war karma was unable to do this at all. It could only expand its destructive range little by little. This was the reason behind this. The three-legged cauldron's intrinsic quality was constantly improving. At every moment, the perfection trait that it possessed was being torn apart by a strong force. At a certain moment, when the aura of Luo Fan's doppelganger had fallen to a certain limit and the aura of a broken perfection reappeared on its body, the power of the three-legged cauldron finally broke through a certain limit. The perfection trait that it possessed finally collapsed and disappeared completely. The three-legged cauldron then emitted a charm that seemed to be able to break through and break free from everything. Following this charm, the three-legged cauldron's power seemed to no longer be shackled. It began to rise endlessly and improve endlessly. Its size also began to expand crazily. At this moment, the residual power of the war karma that Luo Fan's clone possessed seemed to have encountered a black hole as it frantically poured into the three-legged cauldron. Originally, according to the normal speed, the residual power of the war karma might have needed a few months before it could be completely poured into the three-legged cauldron. However, under the effect of this unbelievable suction force, he had completed the process that would normally take a few months in just a couple of hours. All the residual power of the war karma was completely devoured by the three-legged cauldron. It was completely poured into the three-legged cauldron and disappeared from Luo Fan's clone. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's doppelganger finally collapsed once again. One must know that this clone was facing the main body of the will of the world at this moment. Moreover, the entire great world was collapsing and dying. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the pressure that the clone was withstanding at every moment. The reason why he didn't show any signs of being under any pressure before was because but now, the clone had already lost the residual power of the war karma. All the residual power had been completely devoured by the three-legged cauldron. But at this moment, the clone had already lost the remnant power of the battle cause. All of the remnant power had been completely devoured by the three-legged cauldron. Naturally, he had to personally bear the terrifying pressure produced by the destruction of the great world around him. The result of this was naturally the collapse of the clone and the loss of its fixed form. Of course, this collapse only represented the collapse of the body. This was because the material of the clone was too high. Even the impact, pressure, and destruction from the destruction of the great world was clearly not enough to completely destroy the material of the clone. Therefore, although the clone seemed to have collapsed, in reality, it was only a change of form. The will of the clone was still not affected much. It was still constantly controlling the three-legged cauldron, allowing it to continue expanding its range of destruction. It continued to destroy the will of the world and continued to expand the huge hole within it. On the other hand, the power related to the true divine that appeared when the doppelganger collapsed was constantly changing its form under the impact and pressure of the great collapse of the world. It was like a ball of plasticine that was constantly being kneaded by an invisible hand. It could be seen that the pressure and impact from the destruction of the world was trying its best to destroy it. However, it was clear that the clone did not care about such an extremely powerful result. During the process of the world's collapse, time was also in a constant state of collapse. Just when Luo Fan's clone was destroyed and the strength of the three-legged cauldron had already surpassed the shackles of perfection, the time in this world finally became chaotic. Before this, there was still some meaning in talking about time. However, after this, time would no longer have any meaning in this world. Perhaps the flow of time in this location might be millions of times faster than other locations, but in the next instant, this ratio would become 1 in a billion. Perhaps the flow of time in this location was normal at this moment, but in the next moment, the flow of time would become forward. It was so much so that the difference between this moment and the next would actually be meaningless to any location. After all, it seemed that it was uncertain who was in front and who was at the back. At this point, there was naturally no need to talk about time. In the world of laws, Luo Fan's true body could only rely on the connection between himself and his clone to roughly know what state the will of the world was in. As for the time that had passed, even he couldn't be sure. Chapter 2972. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan only did his best to control his clone to destroy the true body of the world will. As for the world of laws, he just let nature take its course. In Luo Fan's true body's perception, tens of thousands of years had passed unknowingly. During this period of time, his clone couldn't determine exactly how much time had passed. It felt like only an instant had passed, but it also felt like billions of years had passed. At this moment, more than half of the world of laws had been destroyed. Although not all of them had been annihilated, there was a 70 to 80% chance that they had been destroyed by the boundless might and power. In terms of losses, the number of lives that had died in this process could even be said to have exceeded the limits of what could be described with numbers. Even if Luo Fan's true body could completely control everything in the world of laws and protect the last bit of life essence of those living beings, he still felt a little overwhelmed at this moment. He even couldn't help but slow down his comprehension of the memories of the previous incarnation of the world will. Previously, when he completely accepted the memories of the previous incarnation of the world will, he could rely on the power related to the true divine to ease the pressure and bear all the memories without feeling much. But now, just protecting the life essence of those countless living beings was already a little overwhelmed. This was enough to show how many living beings had died. As for why he wanted to protect the life essence of those living beings, it was only related to his inner will, and there wasn't much benefit in it. From this aspect, the fact that he was willing to put in so much effort and bear such strong pressure was enough to show that his emotions hadn't been frozen by the endless years on this day. The expression of Luo Fan's true body froze. He suddenly felt that the connection between him and his true body had suddenly weakened. At the same time, the impact and destruction that his world of laws had suffered had also been reduced by many times. Although it still existed, it was no longer targeted like before. Instead, it was more like a kind of pressure that he was extremely familiar with in the past, but he hadn't felt it for a long time. It was a pressure that simulated the state of chaos. He instantly understood that the world will had collapsed, and the great world formed by the tribulation level had collapsed along with the world will. Because the great world formed by the tribulation level had been completely destroyed, the world of laws had returned to a simulated chaotic state. At this moment, the pressure transmitted from the barrier of the world of laws was a kind of pressure that would inevitably be produced by simulating the state of chaos. It was precisely because of this that he felt so familiar with this pressure. After all, before entering this great world, Luo Fan had endured this kind of pressure for countless years in the simulated primal chaos state. At this moment, the connection between his true body and his doppelganger had weakened to such a degree that he could only barely maintain a unified state. He couldn't sense the state of his doppelganger like before, and he couldn't know what his doppelganger was thinking at this moment. This was because his doppelganger had also fallen into a simulated chaotic state. Because he had fallen into the simulated chaotic state, the spiritual connection between his clone and his main body was disrupted by the simulated chaotic state. In fact, this was because it was only a simulated chaotic state and not the true chaotic state. If it was the true chaotic state, the connection between his main body and his clone would have been completely cut off. Even if he could occasionally establish a connection, it would be completely confused by time. Information transmitted from a future might appear in the past, and information transmitted from the past might appear in the future. After clearly understanding the state of his surroundings, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the surroundings of the world of laws underwent subtle changes. All of a sudden, countless paths appeared around him. These countless paths opened up a boundless void, and on the nodes of the paths, there were different worlds. This was the transportation network layer. Obviously, the world of laws had reconnected with the transportation network layer at this time. As the world of laws reconnected with the transportation network layer, Luo Fan felt that the connection between him and his clone had become closer again, and all the senses of his clone reappeared in his heart. Although most of the worlds had been lost, the transportation network layer still existed when Luo Fan was in that great world. The reason for this was actually very simple. In the world of laws, not all the world founders brought their own worlds into the gateway of that great world. In other words, not all the heavens and earth have been devoured by that mighty world. In this simulated, chaotic state, when most of the world creators were swallowed into the great world formed by the tribulation layer, there was still a part of the world left in the transportation network layer, maintaining the existence of the transportation network layer. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was able to reappear in the transportation network layer with his world of laws, and once again feel the small amount of world of laws that existed in the transportation network layer that was tens of thousands of times less than what he had experienced before. At this time, the connection between his clone and his main body became closer again. And the reason was that this clone had also stepped into the transportation network layer at the same time. Because they were both in the transportation network layer at the same time, the interference of the simulated chaotic state on the connection between them naturally disappeared without trace. Naturally, the connection also reappeared. At this moment, in Luo Fan's world of laws, countless world founders suddenly felt some indescribable changes in their surroundings. Vaguely, there seemed to be a feeling of being able to do as they pleased in the depths of their hearts. Then, the hearts of those world founders moved slightly, and they appeared outside the world of laws. They saw the devastated transportation network layer. At the sight of this, all the world founders felt as if a lifetime had passed by. What's going on? Why did I suddenly come back? This thought flashed through their minds, and they felt as if they had forgotten a very important memory. These world founders were originally world founders who had joined the transportation network layer. Because they had an extremely subtle connection with the world of laws, the will of the world had forced them to enter the world of laws through various circumstances in order to use them to plot against Luo Fan. After that, because Luo Fan's means were even more brilliant, they were suppressed in the world of laws one by one. At this time, because Luo Fan's world of laws returned to the transportation network layer and released the suppression on them, they were able to regain their freedom and see the transportation network layer again. At this moment, before these world founders could take any action, they suddenly felt an indescribable terror shrouding them. This kind of terror was so intense that it aroused their strongest survival instincts, causing them to instantly have an extremely intense reaction of fear. At this moment, they couldn't help but look in the direction of the terror. It was a huge, three-legged cauldron, a supreme, three-legged cauldron that seemed to be greater than the entire transportation network layer. The three-legged cauldron was suspended above the transportation network layer at this moment. Although it didn't release any power, its existence alone already brought about endless suppression power, suppressing everything in the transportation network layer, including the large number of worlds and the hundreds of millions of world founders. At this moment, the world founders woke up again, and the unrealistic expectations they originally had were instantly dispelled. Once again, they clearly realized that they were still just ants here. Since they were ants, they could only behave according to the rules set by the ruler and couldn't have any improper thoughts. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron slowly rotated. As it rotated, a figure that they were extremely familiar with appeared onto the three-legged cauldron. They would recognize this figure, even if it turned into ashes. It was Luo Fan's figure. What are you waiting for? Don't you want to create a new world? After Luo Fan appeared, he directly said to the world founders. The world founders seemed to have woken up from a dream at this moment. They finally understood why Luo Fan released the suppression on them and let them out again. They immediately responded and began to move towards various parts of the transportation network layer. They found their positions and began to create a new world that could withstand them. Very soon, the earth, water, fire, and wind surged, and new worlds reappeared in the empty nodes of the transportation network layer. Here it comes again. At this moment, the world founders that originally existed in the transportation network layer all sighed inwardly. These world founders were timid to begin with. They had even given up on the seemingly perfect opportunities from before due to their cautiousness. Now that they were faced with existences like Luo Fan who were coming menacingly, it was easy to imagine what their choice would be. Naturally, they shut their doors tightly, as if nothing had happened and nothing had changed. They continued to obediently stay in their own worlds. Very soon, exclamations of disbelief came from the many worlds that were being created. These were the exclamations of the world founders. How was this possible? I can actually improve endlessly. Where's the tribulation? Why isn't there a tribulation? I can actually surpass the limit directly. How can this happen? Could it be that I've already surpassed the tribulation? That's great. I can finally break through the limit. Such exclamations kept ringing out from the heavens and earth. Just by listening to these voices, one could tell what they were lamenting about. Along with their exclamations, those worlds began to sublimate and evolve at an unimaginable speed. Very soon, they surpassed the limit and reached the level of worlds that had survived 2 great tribulations. Some even surpassed the limit and reached the level of worlds that had survived 3 great tribulations. Originally, this kind of improvement would inevitably be accompanied by the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, just as I thought. After losing the tribulation level, the simulated chaos no longer has any great tribulations. All improvements are no longer limited by the tribulation. Luo Fan's clone watched all this with a faint smile on his face. That great world was formed from the tribulation level, and now, that great world had completely disappeared along with the world's will. This also meant that the tribulation level had completely disappeared. The result of the disappearance of the tribulation level was that there were no more great tribulations in the simulated chaos. Even the tribulation level would no longer exist. This was naturally a good thing for most creators of the universe. After all, it was extremely difficult for most world founders to survive the great tribulations. Even if it was the simplest first great tribulations, many worlds would not be able to survive them. However, this was not all good news. The absence of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was a terrible thing for a small number of ambitious creators of the world. This was because without the great tribulations, the bestowment of the tribulation level that accompanied the great tribulations naturally no longer existed. Without the bestowment of every great tribulations, any world that wanted to improve could only explore and accumulate in the dark bit by bit. Such a situation had obviously cut off the hope of many worlds advancing. Of course, it was impossible for the world founders in the transportation network layer to think of that at this moment. At this moment, they were all excited about the fact that the great tribulations were no longer in their way. They were only trying their best to improve their worlds to the level of the great tribulations that they had gone through in the past. To them, these matters that could further the world's prospects were all matters for the future. At this moment, the simulated chaos began to surge, and an indescribable aura of destruction began to spread. The aura of destruction was so dense and so fundamental that it felt as though the entire simulated chaos state was gradually collapsing and dying. With this change, the transportation network layer also began to tremble slightly, as if it was about to expand endlessly, and also as if it was about to start shrinking again. Chapter 2973. This situation was clearly due to some changes that had never appeared before in the simulated chaos state. As for where these changes came from, there was no need to say anything else. Apart from the will of the simulated chaos state, how could there be anything else? In the face of such changes, many of the world founders were at a loss. They were only worried about the possible disasters in their hearts, but they didn't know what they should do at all. They couldn't help but look at the huge, 3-legged cauldron that was covering the entire transportation network layer at this moment. To be more specific, they were looking at Luo Fan's clone below the 3-legged cauldron. Although they were still rather apprehensive about Luo Fan's identity and didn't get along very well with Luo Fan in the past, they either schemed against Luo Fan and wanted to snatch the world of laws, or they were suppressed in the world of laws. However, in any case, none of them dared to deny how powerful Luo Fan was. At this moment, in the face of this crisis that might affect the entire simulated chaos state and even affect their lives, they naturally couldn't help but place their hopes on Luo Fan, who was clearly many times stronger than them. After all, in their eyes, this disaster wasn't just affecting them. Luo Fan was also affected by this upheaval. In other words, Luo Fan was also facing the same predicament as them. In this way, they would naturally be able to get some inspiration from Luo Fan's response and break through their current state of confusion. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone was expressionless, as if he wasn't surprised by the changes in front of him at all. He only glanced at the many worlds below and then focused his attention on the layer outside the transportation network. At this moment, the entire simulated chaos state was surging. All kinds of order were generated out of thin air in the simulated chaos state, and then quickly annihilated into nothingness. In this state of creation and annihilation, the entire simulated chaos state was no longer characterized by the characteristics of the chaos state. There was only indescribable chaos left. This kind of chaos was not even more chaotic than the chaos caused by a high-level battle in the world. In this chaos, an increasingly powerful pressure converged on the transportation network layer from all directions. Because the surrounding simulated chaotic state had gradually lost its original chaotic characteristics, the traffic network layer, which could only exist in the simulated chaotic state, of course wouldn't be unaffected. At that very moment, every creator in the transportation network could clearly sense the subtle tremors coming from the depths of the transportation network. This trembling made the uneasiness in their hearts even more intense. It must be known that the reason why the creators of worlds were no longer alone and could communicate with other creators of worlds, as well as know how vast the simulated state of chaos was because of the existence of the simulated chaos layer. It was because of the simulated chaotic layer that they could communicate with each other and know that they were not the only ones in the simulated chaotic state. At this moment, they clearly felt that the simulated chaotic layer, which originally existed as a matter of course, seemed to have lost its rightful position. How could they not panic at the thought that they might return to the state of being completely isolated by the simulated chaotic state? They could not help but tremble. Don't ever fall into that state. The same thought appeared in the minds of the world's founders. With such thoughts, they even released their own worlds and tried their best to fuse with other worlds, working hard to strengthen the connection between many worlds. Because of their actions, the roads in the transportation network layer unknowingly widened and became much firmer. The tremors that emanated from the depths of the transportation network layer also weakened a lot. And this weakening was obviously a great encouragement for the many creators of worlds in the transportation network layer. After all, this meant that the direction of their efforts was not wrong. With such encouragement, they naturally became more active in contacting each other and worked hard to strengthen the many roads in the transportation network layer. This change made Luo Fan, who was watching from above, smile uncontrollably. This was the reason why he released the world creators. It was evident that the many world creators were more afraid of the collapse of the transportation network layer than he had imagined. They did not even need him to guide them. As long as they sensed that the transportation network layer might collapse, they would stop it at all costs. As the transportation network layer stabilized, the pressure generated by the birth and death of order, which simulated the state of chaos, naturally weakened a lot on the transportation network layer. The pressure that was brought to Luo Fan was naturally greatly reduced as a result. The simulated chaotic state was a simulation of the chaotic state. Under such circumstances, the birth and death of order represented more than one could imagine. It could be said that the birth and death of order was equivalent to completely breaking the chaotic state. It was precisely because of this that the chaotic state seemed to be about to be destroyed appeared in the hearts of the many world creators in the transportation network layer. In fact, it was not just the world pioneers in the transportation network layer. Even the other world pioneers who still existed in the simulated chaos state felt that the state of chaos could collapse at any time. In an instant, an inexplicable panic filled the entire simulated chaotic state. Amidst the endless birth and death of order, a huge face vaguely appeared in the simulated chaotic state. This face seemed to casually appear in a very ordinary corner of the simulated chaotic state. But upon a closer look, one could clearly see that this face was facing the simulated chaotic state no matter which layer it was in. It was the same for the transportation network layer. At this moment, Luo Fan looked outside the transportation network layer and directly saw the incomparably huge face that was completely constructed by the birth and death of order. This face was so huge that it felt as if 1 trillion worlds filled with laws were just a tiny, insignificant speck in it. In fact, compared to the previous world, the difference between this world and the world was even greater. This face had the appearance of a human. Faintly, he looked somewhat similar to Luo Fan. In the eyes of many world creators, the simulated chaotic state was just a layer of the void that was separated from the chaotic state. But in fact, the relationship between the simulated chaotic state and the simulated chaotic state was not that shallow. If it was just a layer of the void that was separated from the simulated chaotic state to accommodate many worlds, the simulated chaotic state would be outside the simulated chaotic state. This seemed to be in line with the senses of many world creators and proved the correctness of this structure. But it was obvious that this was not the case. The reason why the relationship between the simulated chaotic state and the simulated chaotic state seemed so simple was because the world creators only had the senses of living beings. Because their senses were only the senses of living beings, everything they saw was just a state that was distorted according to their senses. And the result of this distortion was the simulated chaotic state, and the current structure appeared in the simulated chaotic state. In fact, the actual situation was that the simulated chaotic state, strictly speaking, did not exist at all. The countless simulated chaotic states that existed in the simulated chaotic state were actually just a collection of connections established by a certain subtle resonance between many worlds. In other words, from the perspective of their true positions, the two sides that were extremely close to each other in a certain simulated chaos layer might be infinitely far away from each other in their true positions. It was only because the resonance between them was stronger and many aspects of them were more compatible with each other that they seemed to be close to each other in the simulated chaotic state. This was the case for many other simulated chaotic states, and it was the same for the transportation network layer. It was precisely because of this that the face formed by the birth and death of many orders could directly appear outside the countless simulated chaotic states in such a way. That was why it seemed to be facing the countless simulated chaotic states. After all, from the perspective of the huge face, the countless simulated chaotic states actually did not exist. In its senses, the simulated chaotic states were just a collection of all sorts of connections. And from the perspective of living beings, the two simulated chaotic states that seemed to be separated by an infinite distance and had no connection with each other were just countless connections superimposed on the same simulated chaotic state. In that case, no matter where it appeared in this simulated chaotic state, it would not make any difference to the many simulated chaotic layers. As long as it was willing to be discovered by the world creators in any simulated chaotic state, then the world creators in the simulated chaotic states would discover its existence and face it directly. No matter how far apart the two simulated chaotic states were in the eyes of the world creators, no matter how far apart they were, it was the same. At this moment, the huge face that appeared in front of Luo Fan's eyes was the same. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone looked at the huge face in front of him and said, "As long as I defeat you, I'll be considered to have won, right?" At this moment, countless orders were born and destroyed rapidly. Along with this birth and destruction, a subtle feeling spread to Luo Fan's heart. In the end, it turned into an incomparably grand and incomparably mysterious voice. "You have to be able to do it. Right now, I'm in front of you with my true body, and I'm not as weak as the clone from before." This was the content contained in that voice. It was evident that the huge face was speaking. This way of speaking was abnormally mysterious, but was also so natural. After all, the face itself was constructed by countless orders born and destroyed. And in this simulated chaotic state, it seemed like only the birth and destruction of orders could spread and be understood by living beings. It's actually not difficult to do this, right? Although it's said to be defeated, all I need to do is to hold on. Right now, you've already destroyed the foundation of your existence. As long as I can hold on for long enough, you'll completely collapse, and I'll naturally obtain the final victory. Luo Fan smiled faintly. "Time? You're talking about time in front of me?" The face sneered. Time was obviously meaningless to simulate the state of chaos. After all, simulated chaotic states were a state that messed up time itself. In such a state, the past, present, and future were obviously mixed up together. Besides, they were all existences that could be completely controlled by the consciousness that simulated chaotic states. Under such circumstances, no matter how long the face could exist, it could turn this period of time into eternity. At least to living beings, it would be eternity. That was why it said such a thing earlier on. At this moment, upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "You have to be able to control everything in here first. But can you do that? Don't forget that that power isn't something you can shake." The face's expression changed abruptly. It was evident that Luo Fan's words had grasped its biggest weakness. Even though it was a will that simulated the state of chaos, it clearly couldn't control everything as it pleased in the simulated state of chaos formed by the Great Tribulation. Although it could control everything that simulated chaotic states that were within the understanding of most world creators, however, beyond the understanding of the vast majority of the world's founders, there was still something special in the simulated chaos. That was the power that was related to true saints that enveloped Luo Fan's true body at this moment. Chapter 2974. The power related to the true sage had such a special characteristic. Not to mention that Luo Fan's real body was inside that power. Even if he didn't have any contact with this power, he could still use this mysterious characteristic of this power through various subtle means to bypass the control of the time attribute of the world of laws that simulated the state of primal chaos. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly in response to the face's words. "You can give a try then." At this moment, the entire world of laws began to expand crazily like a balloon being blown. The countless parallel planes that were originally destroyed by the final eruption of the world's will in that great world were reborn at an unimaginable speed. In just a few short breaths, they had all recovered. As these parallel planes recovered, the world of laws seemed to be at least thousands of times larger than before. Fortunately, the transportation network layer's capacity for the world actually didn't have much to do with the size of the world. No matter how big the world was, as long as it could appear in the transportation network layer, it would be an important part of the structure of the transportation network layer itself. It was the same for Luo Fan's world of laws. In this way, no matter how many times the world of laws expanded, even if it expanded by 1,000,000,000,000 times, it would only be a very, very small part of the transportation network layer, and it wouldn't squeeze any world that was also in the transportation network layer. No matter how close the world of laws was to the world of laws. At this moment, the face formed by order, life, and death frowned slightly. Immediately after, an invisible power penetrated the entire transportation network layer and enveloped everything in it, including Luo Fan's world of laws. As this invisible power penetrated, the flow of time in the entire transportation network layer began to accelerate. 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. As it accelerated, the face of order, life, and death also changed at the same time, not slowing down in the slightest due to the change in the flow of time in the transportation network layer. Seems like the effect is pretty good. At this moment, the face of order, life, and death said. There wasn't the slightest bit of complacency on its face, as if everything was within its expectations and under its control. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan just shook his head lightly. Then, with a thought, many roads in the transportation network layer began to light up one after another. The number of roads in the transportation network layer was extremely large. Any world would have roads connecting multiple worlds. With such a nature, when the number of worlds in the transportation network layer reached hundreds of millions, the number of roads would reach an unimaginable scale. The countless paths became extremely sturdy due to the many pioneers of the world having sensed the danger of collapsing the transportation network layer and did all they could to strengthen the connection between the world. In this way, these paths had the possibility of withstanding some kind of formation. The number of paths was enough for the formation pattern to be outlined. Moreover, the road was sturdy enough, allowing it to withstand the supreme might released after the formation was formed. At this time, what Luo Fan did was to use the incomparably mysterious, incomparably complex strange runes that he had obtained from the power related to the true divine. In other words, it was a strange formation. Of course, These paths were not completely constructed according to the formation or the shape of the runes. Therefore, if he used these paths to outline a rune or formation, there would definitely be many places that were slightly different from the real rune or formation. In other words, it would seem rather crude. However, no matter how crude it was still the result of the rune or formation slightly deforming. Its might was secondary, but the connection between the rune or formation that existed within the power related to the true divine would definitely not be discounted at all. It was just like how cultivators who had reached the innate Grand Luo realm would usually develop a special sensing ability. For most innate Grand Luo realm cultivators with a sturdy foundation, once they became innate Grand Luo, their sensing ability would undergo some sort of transformation. At that time, as long as some words related to them were mentioned within a certain range, such as their name, their Taoist name, or other nouns that pointed to them, they would naturally be able to sense it. This sensing ability would continuously strengthen along with the cultivator's cultivation realm. When one's strength reached Luo Fan's level, this sensing ability would even be strengthened to the extent that it could even be sensed across the world. Moreover, one did not even need to speak and could sense it with just a thought. This sensing ability would obviously not be cut off just because one spoke in a dialect when they were talking about nouns related to cultivators. No matter what language was used, as long as one had such thoughts, and as long as the words were spoken that pointed to that direction, even if it was just talking about that person, it would trigger this sensing ability. This sensing ability was that domineering. At this time, the formation that was outlined by the paths in the transportation network layer was equivalent to some sort of language that pointed to the mysterious rune within the power related to the true divine. This language clearly did not require the formation to be exactly the same as the real formation. Right now, there was a slight difference between it and the real formation, and it seemed rather crude. At most, it was the difference between standard Mandarin and a dialect. Obviously, this difference wasn't enough to cut off the connection between the formation and the rune or the formation within that force. Therefore, at this moment, the corresponding paths in the transportation network layer lit up one after another. After directly outlining the formation in a somewhat rough manner, the power related to the true divine involuntarily emitted some kind of subtle aura and directly injected into the huge formation. It began to flow along the lines of the formation, which was the endless paths. In the blink of an eye, it had already flowed through the many activated paths in the entire transportation network layer. As this aura flowed, the magical power released by the face of order that filled the entire transportation network layer instantly collapsed. The flow of time that was originally controlled by that power began to accelerate rapidly, began to slow down. By the time Luo Fan began to pay attention, the paths in the entire transportation network layer had already returned to their original state, which was the same flow of time as the power related to the true divine in the world of laws. At this moment, in the face of such changes, Luo Fan looked at the face of order indifferently. At this moment, the eyes of the face of order revealed a look of disbelief, and the flow of time also began to slow down rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already returned to the same flow of time as the transportation network layer. It was not that the face of order didn't want to continue to accelerate time, but that it could no longer accelerate time. At the very least, if it wanted to deal with Luo Fan again and the transportation network layer, it couldn't continue to accelerate time and could only face Luo Fan at the same flow of time. After all, there is a dimensional difference between different flows of time. In the face of existences at their level, this dimensional difference was not enough to stop the spread of information and make them turn a blind eye to each other. However, in terms of power and might, this dimensional difference was difficult to surpass. Just like this order life and death face, if it really went all out, it could indeed cross different time dimensions to attack Luo Fan. However, this kind of attack would inevitably be mostly consumed in maintaining the difference in dimensions. That's right, it wasn't breaking through the dimensional difference, but maintaining the dimensional difference. The existence of the dimensional difference was brought about by the different flow of time in two locations. In such a situation, if one's power was strong enough to break through the dimensional difference and descend from the high flow of time to the low flow of time, one would obviously need to slow down the flow of time. Once this happened, the power would obviously become the bridge between the two different time dimensions, breaking through the dimensional difference completely. Under such circumstances, the more powerful this force was, the more destructive it would be to the dimensional difference. In order to maintain the dimensional difference and be able to cross dimensions to release this power, one would obviously need to use some means to stabilize the dimensional difference, so that this dimensional difference could reach a level where even the power acting as a bridge couldn't destroy it. And destroying was obviously much easier than maintaining it. A 1,000-mile dike could be destroyed by an ant's nest. This meant that one had to nip the problem in the bud. But from another perspective, didn't it also mean that destroying was countless times easier than building? It went without saying how much effort was needed to build a dike. But if he wanted to destroy this dam, all he needed to do was to destroy the nest of some ants. Was there any need to say how big the difference between the two was? For an existence at the level of the order life and death face, perhaps one didn't need to use the order life and death face to harm a powerhouse at Luo Fan's level. However, no matter how much one didn't need to use their full strength, it definitely couldn't be done casually. If it was that easy, why would the order life and death face be forced to this step by Luo Fan? It could be said that in order to truly threaten Luo Fan, a conservative estimate would be at least 10% to 20%. And how much power would be needed to eliminate the dimensional difference that 10% to 20% of the order life and death face's power? Perhaps even 10% to 20% of the order life and death face's power might not be able to maintain it. Obviously, 10 times the power of the order life and death face wasn't something that the order life and death face could release by itself. Therefore, at this moment, the order life and death face couldn't attack Luo Fan while maintaining the time flow difference. He could only honestly slow down his own time flow to the same level as Luo Fan's time flow, eliminating the dimensional difference that originally existed between the two. Even if slowing down the time flow to this extent would greatly reduce the time he could sustain, it was still the same. After all, so what if he could last longer? As long as he attacked Luo Fan, the time flow difference would be completely broken, and it wouldn't be any different from now. Luo Fan stood there quietly and looked at the faces of the Order Masters who were filled with inexplicable disappointment. There was only a faint smile on his face, as if everything was under control. Seems like I should be able to last until you die, completely. Luo Fan said calmly. The Order Life and Death face sighed. It's a pity that the power we found this time is too unique. Otherwise, who knows how long you would have been dead. No. It's not that the power we found this time is unique. Rather, this kind of personality was inevitable. That's a power related to a true divine. Do you think that power can be controlled so easily? Even if the power that was attracted by the calamity wasn't this one, as long as its level reached that level, there wouldn't be much difference. At most, I'm afraid the form of expression will be a little different. Luo Fan just smiled. The Order Life and Death face sighed again. Seems like you've indeed analyzed many things from his memories. When Luo Fan heard this, he was not surprised at all. He could hide the memories of the previous owner of the world's will from others, but he definitely couldn't hide it from the world's will. Of course, he couldn't hide it from the Order Life and Death face, which was a simulated chaos state. After all, this simulated chaos state was the body of the Order Life and Death face. As long as it was willing to investigate, it would definitely be able to know everything that happened. Unless it happened inside the power related to a true divine that it couldn't control. Obviously, the process in which Luo Fan obtained the memories of the previous owner of the worlds didn't happen inside that power, but in the core of the world of laws. Although Luo Fan had full authority over the core, it was obviously formed from a part of the simulated chaos state. Of course, it couldn't be completely separated from the senses of the simulated chaos state. Although some things have been researched, the real essence is still looking at the flowers through the fog. Luo Fan said with a sigh at this time. Chapter 2975. This kind of situation caused 100 claws to claw at one's heart, and it was extremely vexing. However, it was obvious that this was normal. Although Luo Fan felt rather uncomfortable, he didn't immerse himself in it for too long. After thinking for a while, he calmed down. After all, that was the essence of the great calamity. This kind of existence, even in the true state of chaos, was a huge secret. How could it be easily obtained from the incarnation of the will in a simulated state of chaos? Even if the simulated state of chaos was derived from the great calamity, it was still the case. The face of order, life, and death sneered. It's already great fate to be able to research this. You still want more? What do you think this is? This is your great calamity. As he said this, the face of order, life, and death trembled violently. Faintly, the face seemed to lose its shape. It took a long while before it recovered with great difficulty. It seemed like the face of order, life, and death couldn't maintain the stability of its face due to its emotions being too agitated. It also seemed like the foundation of its existence had already been shaken, and it couldn't maintain its stability. As for which situation it was hard to distinguish. However, in Luo Fan's opinion, the second possibility was more likely. After all, the face of order, life, and death was a will that simulated the state of chaos. The level of this will was so high that it had definitely reached the upper limit of the simulated state of chaos. How could it lose control of its own emotions with such a high level of will? How could it be unable to maintain its face due to its agitated emotions? At least, compared to the second possibility, the first possibility was obviously more impossible. Don't you want to attack for the last time? Luo Fan's clone looked at the face of order, life, and death calmly and said so. At this moment, his vigilance had been raised to the highest level. After all, no matter which possibility it was, it meant that the face of order, life, and death was likely to unleash an unbelievable attack. The first possibility was that it couldn't maintain its face due to its agitated emotions. Needless to say, it was obvious that it wanted to destroy the source of its emotions. As for the second possibility, because its foundation had been damaged and it couldn't continue, it might not even be able to launch the final attack. Of course, you don't think I'll just let it go, do you? The face of order, creation, and destruction suddenly laughed. Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little disappointed when he heard that. He was hoping that the order face of life and death would say that the attack wouldn't be effective, but he didn't expect it to be so rational. At this moment, the transportation network layer suddenly felt an incredible pressure. All kinds of strange attacks appeared out of thin air around the many worlds in the transportation network layer. They poured into the many worlds and smashed into them. In just an instant, thousands of worlds were completely destroyed by that attack, causing those worlds to completely collapse. Furthermore, the destruction of these worlds was extremely thorough. It was the kind of annihilation that caused the creators of the world to perish together. This change shocked the many founders of the world in the transportation network layer. How could they care about anything else? He hurriedly worked hard to gather his own strength, his own might, to help the world he had opened up to resist this sudden attack. However, it was a pity that this sudden attack was too powerful. Facing such a powerful attack, even if the creators of the heavens and earth had resisted with all their might, not even 1 in 10,000 heavens and earth could survive the first wave of attacks. What the hell is going on? Some world founders roared indignantly. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone looked down at the countless attacks that appeared out of thin air in the entire transportation network layer and frowned. He naturally knew what was going on with these attacks. In fact, these attacks were the source of the pressure on the transportation network layer. In other words, it was because of these attacks that the transportation network layer suffered such terrifying pressure. The reason why these attacks appeared was because the consciousness that simulated the state of chaos was attacking the transportation network layer from another perspective. At this moment, to the many founders of the world in the transportation network layer, this attack seemed to have appeared out of thin air. However, in fact, to the face of order creation and destruction, it was directly attacking the many worlds in the simulated state of chaos. Because it was directly attacking the worlds in the simulated state of chaos, the attacks would directly appear on those worlds. At this moment, in the eyes of the many world founders, they could not see the true simulated state of chaos at all. What they saw was only the peculiar void that appeared from the connection between the many worlds in the transportation network layer. This contradiction in perspective naturally led to the current situation. The attacks had directly reached the many heavens and earth from the outside, without going through any process at all. In a way that ordinary people could understand, the transportation network layer was like a piece of paper. The worlds opened up by the many world founders were like circles drawn on this piece of paper. The face of order creation and destruction was like someone outside of this piece of paper. At this moment, the situation was that someone outside of this piece of paper was directly stabbing the circles on this piece of paper with a knife and destroying those circles. This kind of situation was extremely normal in anyone's eyes. However, in the eyes of the creature on that piece of paper, it was clear that the attack was extremely strange. It appeared out of thin air in the surroundings of the world and directly destroyed the world. The entire process didn't have any intermediate stages. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone finally made a move. An unimaginable suppressive force was released from the three-legged cauldron and pressed down on the entire transportation network layer. In the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the entire surface of the transportation network layer, causing everything in the transportation network layer to be suppressed by that suppressive force. Boom, boom, boom. Although this suppressive force had a suppressive effect, at the same time, it also had an indescribable exclusivity. This exclusivity caused it to clash violently with the various attacks that were wreaking havoc in many worlds. All sorts of unimaginable light, shadows, and sound waves were constantly released from the point of contact between the attacks and the suppressive force, causing the entire transportation network layer to be extremely chaotic. The countless worlds within seemed to have turned into willow catkins in the wind. However, due to the suppressive force, even if the worlds became like willow catkins in the wind, they weren't really damaged. At this moment, facing such changes, the expression of the order, birth, and destruction face didn't change at all. In the blink of an eye, the order, birth, and destruction around the face suddenly accelerated by thousands of times. If one were to observe from a macroscopic perspective, the acceleration of the birth and destruction of order wasn't only limited to the region around the face of order. Instead, it had expanded to the entire simulated chaos, enveloping every single location in the entire simulated chaos. Vaguely, wisps of strange, ominous aura were born from the order, birth, and destruction and began to gather at the order face along the order, birth, and destruction. However, under this change, all sorts of strange changes occurred around the many worlds within the transportation network layer. Vaguely, the many worlds seemed to have become slightly blurry. The entire transportation network layer began to tremble violently, and the many roads that existed in it began to collapse at this time, and then they continued to be connected. At a glance, one could tell that this situation was a sign that the entire transportation network layer was losing its foundation. Compared to the previous attacks that directly appeared around the world, the loss of the foundation of the transportation network layer was more fundamental and more extreme. It was also more effective. Perish together? At this time, a dignified expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He no longer dared to hold back. He let the three-legged cauldron begin to release an endless suppressive force, directly covering the entire transportation network layer. He wanted to protect the connection of the transportation network layer and continue to reconnect the many heavens and earth. However, this method was getting more and more difficult. In the beginning, as long as there was a suppressive force, this connection could be preserved. However, as time passed, as the depth of the order, birth, and destruction deepened, it became more and more difficult to achieve this. In the beginning, only 1,000th of the three-legged cauldron's power was needed to connect the roads and reconnect the many worlds. But later on, The consumption had increased to the point that the three-legged cauldron had to unleash its full strength. Not only did the suppressive force need to be fully unleashed, but it also needed to exhaust the final potential of the three-legged cauldron in order to barely maintain the existence of the countless roads. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron hovered above the transportation network layer and looked even more majestic. Vaguely, the three-legged cauldron constantly let out rattling noises that could be clearly heard by all the creators in the transportation network layer. Evidently, at this moment, the worlds opened up by the creators had already used an extremely strange method to suppress the three-legged cauldron. At this moment, from a macroscopic perspective, the essence of the order, birth, and destruction phase had gradually changed. Its interior had already been filled with an indescribable ominous aura. The ominous aura was surging and brewing inside the order, birth, and destruction phase. The ominous aura was not ordinary, and its terrifying power was even more astonishing than the simulated state of chaos. It was none other than the source of the Great Calamity, as well as the appearance of the Great Calamity before the simulated state of chaos was born. It could be said that the composition of the simulated state of chaos was because of the power related to the true divine. However, the material of its composition was the ominous aura. In other words, it was this kind of baleful aura that had gone through various indescribable changes and subtle constructions that formed the boundless, extremely mysterious, and even gave birth to the endless creators of the world and the endless simulated chaotic state of the world. At this moment, the order, birth, and destruction phase, which was also the consciousness of the simulated state of chaos, was using some indescribable method to return its body to its origin and reconstruct the ominous aura. Looking at its current performance, it was obvious that this step had already achieved initial results. The expression of the order, birth, and destruction phase constantly changed, as if there were countless emotions constantly flowing in its heart. The eyes on the face revealed all sorts of emotions, such as madness, confusion, joy, excitement, pain, sorrow, helplessness, and so on. At this moment, in the face of such changes, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable feeling. It seemed that the difficulty of carrying the many worlds was much easier than he had previously thought. It was as if some kind of existence was going with the flow and wanted to carry these worlds. He frowned slightly and slightly relaxed the suppressive force, only to realize that the pressure exerted on him by the world was also slightly relaxed at the same time. Compared to the overall terrifying pressure, this slight difference was definitely a negligible change. Even if it was Luo Fan himself, if he did not pay close attention to any of the changes, he was afraid that he would also miss this slight change at this moment. Faced with this change, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Although the situation did not affect him much, it showed one thing. There was really something that was going with the flow and throwing these worlds onto his three-legged cauldron. And now, in this simulated state of chaos, or rather, in this great calamity, apart from the consciousness of the simulated state of chaos, who else had the qualifications and ability to do this? I really can't relax for even a moment. If I'm not careful, I'll be tricked by you. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone said with an extremely ugly expression. Chapter 2976. At this moment, Luo Fan was full of admiration for the face of life and death, or rather, the will that simulated the state of chaos. Even though he had a high estimation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, he didn't expect it to be able to achieve this. Even in an extremely harsh situation that seemed like it could completely collapse at any time, it could still find a way out. Moreover, it seemed like a rather perfect way out. What the will that simulated the state of chaos did was nothing else but to use the transportation network layer that Luo Fan had constructed to stabilize its will. Then, it allowed its body to return to its original state, returning to the state of the source of the simulated state of chaos. After that, it fused with the source of the aura and placed its will on the aura, allowing itself to become the will of the aura that had no will of its own. This process seemed to be giving up on the incomparably mysterious state of chaos, but it was only a superficial loss. In fact, if everything went as planned by the will that simulated the state of chaos, in the end, the will would completely break free from the shackles of the simulated state of chaos. Its level would completely increase by a level. One must know that compared to the simulated state of chaos, the aura produced by the great calamity was like a source and derivative. Originally, the will was the will that simulated the state of chaos, which was equivalent to the will of a derivative. But once the plan succeeded, it would become the will of the source. This was equivalent to breaking a layer of shackles and rising to a whole new level. Evidently, this was extremely beneficial to that will. It went without saying. Among them, the most obvious benefit was that the collapse of the simulated state of chaos would no longer have any impact on the will. It would not be like now, where the simulated state of chaos collapsed, and it would completely perish. It could be said that this plan alone was enough to break free from the hopeless situation it was in. At this moment, the face of life and death knew that it could not delay any longer. With a soft cry, the face of life and death collapsed with a loud bang. The boundless aura hidden within the face of life and death instantly broke through the shackles of the face of life and death and slammed into the transportation network layer. In just an instant, an endless baleful aura had already appeared out of nowhere around the boundless world in the transportation network layer, completely drowning the many worlds within it. ZZZZZ. At this moment, all sorts of corrosive sounds came from the various worlds and began to surge in the transportation network layer. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression became extremely solemn. His three-legged cauldron was also being eroded by the boundless, baleful aura. Sizzling sounds were constantly being emitted from the surface of the three-legged cauldron. At this moment, under Luo Fan's control, the three-legged cauldron began to shake. Bad anger Magoo can Huan department, Mu Qian regret, warblers and sodium litigation wall, stinky, nafe. Catching the row rabbit is bad. The moment the two collided, an incomparably complex change occurred between the killing intent and the suppressive force. Order, chaos, space-time, world, heaven and earth, rules, laws, great Tao, all sorts of changes that were beyond the imagination of living beings kept surging out at this moment, constantly breaking down the baleful aura and the suppressive force. That baleful aura and suppressive power were both incomparably high-level existences. Among them, the baleful aura was all-encompassing, containing everything that was simulated in the state of chaos. It can be said that it has reached the peak of complexity. But this suppressive force was extremely pure, to the point that there was nothing else in it. Even time and space, even the rules, principles, cause and effect, and even order, none of them remained. Everything was obviously completely rejected by the suppressive force. At this time, the collision between the suppressive force and the baleful aura was like a conflict between two extreme existences. One could imagine the huge movement that erupted. At this moment, around the three-legged cauldron, there seemed to be a chaotic state of mind that was being completely broken. At a glance, one could only see endless light and shadows constantly being born and annihilated. Moreover, during this process of birth and annihilation, it continued to expand, gradually covering the entire transportation network layer below. While the transportation network layer was undergoing such a drastic change, the baleful aura outside the transportation network layer had already started to condense continuously, gradually turning from a shapeless, baleful aura into a form similar to Luo Fan's. In Luo Fan's understanding, it had the appearance of a born Taoism aptitude. In other words, it had the appearance of a human. It's a pity that it's still a little too early. The figure sighed after taking shape. At this moment, although the surrounding baleful aura was still trying its best to shrink into its body, its speed was many times slower than before. If he were to continue at this speed, he was afraid that more than half of the baleful aura would remain outside and would not be able to re-enter his body. Obviously, the baleful aura figure was very unwilling to accept this. After all, according to its original plan, all the baleful aura should have entered its body by now. However, although it couldn't devour all the baleful aura, it was still formed from the baleful aura. It had a natural ability to control the endless baleful aura around it. That was why, as he raised his hand and waved it slightly, the murderous aura that filled everything around him, replacing the simulated state of chaos, the void, and everything else in this calamity, began to wildly gather towards the faintly discernible transportation network layer before him. For the baleful aura life form, the gathering of the baleful aura was a gathering of nutrients that could greatly strengthen its body. However, compared to other life forms, or rather, compared to other things, the baleful aura was clearly the worst thing. Even if it came into contact with even a little bit of it, it would probably never be able to reincarnate. At this moment, the endless baleful aura converged towards the transportation network layer. In the blink of an eye, the originally faintly discernible transportation network layer had completely collapsed. The remaining world creators were immediately assimilated by the endless baleful aura and completely fused with it, disappearing without a trace. During this process, the creators of the heavens and earth also couldn't resist the ominous aura at all. They had also melted into the ominous aura and disappeared without a trace. Those worlds were created by the world creators from the simulated chaotic state, and in essence, they were also derived from the source baleful aura that simulated chaotic state. In this way, they could naturally fuse with the source baleful aura. Similarly, although the world creators seemed to have created those worlds, they were not the same. But don't forget, what was their origin? Although they might have their original forms in the true chaotic state. In this place, in Luo Fan's Seven Tribulation, they were only living beings that were created to explain the existence of those worlds in the simulated chaotic state. In other words, they were also the source baleful aura. Since that was the case, if the source baleful aura wanted them, they could only fuse with the source baleful aura. Just like what was happening at this moment. By the time Luo Fan came back to his senses, only the world of laws and the three-legged cauldron were left in the entire transportation network layer, which was still being eroded by the boundless baleful aura. Moreover, at this moment, the three-legged cauldron seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. It seemed like even the huge and mysterious three-legged cauldron couldn't withstand the corrosion of the baleful aura. Only Luo Fan's world of laws didn't cause much of a commotion amidst the boundless baleful aura. Although the baleful aura enveloped the world of laws, it was extremely calm where the two came into contact. However, the point of contact between the two was extremely calm. It was as if the two were the same thing. The baleful aura gently bypassed the world of law and didn't cause any damage to the world of law. Similarly, the world of laws seemed to completely ignore the baleful aura. It allowed the baleful aura to engulf it, and it didn't do anything to the baleful aura. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The three-legged cauldron shook in the void, and the boundless suppressive force that filled the surroundings disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. As it disappeared, the true appearance of the three-legged cauldron was revealed once again, and it appeared in the boundless baleful aura. The baleful aura could even simulate the chaotic state, so it naturally couldn't be ordinary baleful aura. The baleful aura contained the attributes of time and space, as well as everything in the world that could and could not be thought of. At this moment, they had clearly replaced everything in the simulated primal chaos, including the burden they had to bear on matter and the world. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan seemed to have expected it. Immediately, as the three-legged cauldron rotated slightly, it began to produce a powerful suction force that frantically devoured the endless baleful aura in the surroundings. The endless baleful aura turned into endless chi dragons that continuously surged into the mouth of the three-legged cauldron and fused into its interior. At this moment, strange crackling sounds came from the three-legged cauldron. These sounds were so strange and dense that it felt as if there were all sorts of indescribable structures that were constantly collapsing inside the three-legged cauldron. Along with these changes, the three-legged cauldron seemed to become slightly blurry. Faintly, there was a sign that he was about to collapse. At this moment, the baleful aura figure had already walked under the three-legged cauldron. It completely ignored the surrounding baleful aura and directly faced Luo Fan, who was standing below the three-legged cauldron. Are you planning to give up on yourself? The baleful aura figure looked at Luo Fan's clone, who was protected by the three-legged cauldron through the baleful aura. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron did not release anything like a protective barrier to envelop Luo Fan's clone. However, this did not mean that the clone wasn't protected by the three-legged cauldron. The reason for this was that the three-legged cauldron still existed and could still resist the collision of the baleful aura. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone had used an inexplicable method to completely fuse with the three-legged cauldron. With the help of this fusion, the clone looked like a part of the three-legged cauldron, and its fate was completely linked to the three-legged cauldron. In this way, the three-legged cauldron wouldn't be destroyed, and Luo Fan's clone wouldn't be destroyed or damaged. It was precisely because of this that the baleful aura figure could come here and talk to Luo Fan's clone. In response to the baleful aura figure's words, Luo Fan's clone only smiled faintly and said, "If all the baleful aura is under your control, I would naturally be giving up on myself. However, it's obvious that the baleful aura you control now is at most 30%, right?" Hearing this, the baleful aura figure frowned slightly and said, "Looks like you have a plan that I don't know about. In that case, let me see if you can widen my horizons." At this moment, the three-legged cauldron above suddenly emitted an unbelievable roar. These booms were very strange. They smashed into the endless baleful aura in the surroundings and naturally created an endless world of sound waves. However, under the pressure of the baleful aura, they were quickly annihilated and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Afterward, the three-legged cauldron that was gradually becoming blurry suddenly stabilized again, and the illusory feeling had completely disappeared. Faced with this situation, the baleful aura figure's expression turned ugly. "You actually absorbed the baleful aura? How is this possible? This is your tribulation. How can you absorb your tribulation?" After a while, the baleful aura figure finally couldn't help but question. If it was something that was derived from the baleful aura, then it was still understandable. It was like using pig dung to grow vegetables, and the vegetables that were grown could indeed be said to be derived from a pig dung. Vegetables were obviously edible, but if someone was asked to eat pig dung, then it was obvious that very few people would be able to stomach it. Chapter 2977. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron had completely stabilized. From the looks of it, it had changed quite a bit from its initial appearance. Just based on its size alone, it was already at least one size smaller than it was at the beginning. Other than that, the instinctive pressure that the surrounding evil aura exerted on the three-legged cauldron had actually disappeared without a trace. It was as if the three-legged cauldron had already established an extremely subtle connection with the surrounding evil aura, and they were no longer incompatible with each other. "There are some things that only require a thought," Luo Fan said indifferently. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron had absorbed the boundless power and energy from the great world, but had already been replaced by the boundless ominous aura. Or, to put it more accurately, the power and might within the three-legged round cauldron that had been absorbed from the great world had returned to its origin and transformed back into the source of the baleful aura. One must know that Luo Fan had spent a lot of effort and great intelligence to absorb the power and energy from the great world, and it seemed as if it had completely belonged to him. However, the truth was that the power and energy came from the great world, and the great world itself came from the simulated chaotic state. In this case, the power and energy had clearly evolved from the source of the ominous aura. Moreover, it could even carry the will of the simulated primal chaos, just like the simulated primal chaos. In other words, The will in the simulated chaotic state could remain unscathed when the entire simulated chaotic state returned to its origin and returned to the appearance of the ominous aura. The power and energy within the three-legged cauldron had clearly contributed to it. Even at this moment, the power and energy that the will could so easily control the ominous aura was also a part of it. For the will, the simulated chaotic state that was derived from the ominous aura was its body and foundation. Although he had already placed his will on the ominous aura and transformed the ominous aura into his new body, he was still unable to control it. However, the entire process had been disrupted by Luo Fan. But now, this kind of entrustment couldn't be perfect. The result of this imperfection was that even though he had placed most of his consciousness on the baleful aura humanoid figure, he still had to bear the powerful destructive force that the baleful aura humanoid figure had on his consciousness. Under such circumstances, he obviously needed another foundation to support his existence in order to maintain his will. Only by accomplishing this would he be able to pursue the next step and completely fuse with the baleful aura humanoid figure and completely control the baleful aura. Evidently, for the will that simulated the state of chaos, another form of support for its existence was the remnant of the simulated state of chaos. Even though the remnants seemed to have been refined and fused by Luo Fan, the effects would not be much weaker for him. At this moment, what Luo Fan did was obviously to sever the support of that will. Of course, at this moment, it seemed that this method was quite effective. At this moment, the body of the baleful aura figure became slightly blurry. The connection between the edge of the baleful aura humanoid figure and the endless baleful aura around it seemed to have become less distinct. In fact, the baleful aura humanoid figure's control over the surrounding baleful aura seemed to have weakened a little. Is it enough just thinking about it? The expression of the baleful aura humanoid figure became extremely ugly. The baleful aura humanoid figure was the will that simulated the state of chaos, and the world that was derived from the simulated state of chaos was simply endless. Similarly, the world creators that were derived from it were also endless. In this way, there was naturally no need to mention the breadth of his knowledge. Hence, he naturally understood what Luo Fan was referring to. Being able to solve the problem just by thinking about it was completely valid for existences at their level to solve most difficult problems. Whether it was splitting the sky and earth, creating endless space-time out of thin air, constructing karma, constructing fate, constructing the great Tao, etc., it was the same. However, all of this was based on the fact that these difficult problems were possible for existences at their level. If the problem was beyond the scope of the abilities of existences at their level, then thinking about it would only be thinking about it at most, but it would definitely not be able to solve the problem. Evidently, in the heart of the baleful aura humanoid figure, what Luo Fan was doing, the act of directly devouring the baleful aura and changing the nature of his magic treasure, was already beyond the scope of those difficult problems that could be solved just by thinking about it. However, the baleful aura humanoid figure also knew that this was not the time to be dwelling on this. Regardless of what method the other party used, and regardless of whether the other party could really solve the problem of fusing the baleful aura just by thinking about it, he had already completely fused his magic treasure with the baleful aura. It was obviously meaningless to continue dwelling on it. To him, the most important thing now was to stop the baleful aura humanoid figure from advancing further. For the current baleful aura humanoid figure, it was necessary to simulate the remnants of the state of chaos. Without the remnants of the simulated state of chaos, it would completely lose control of the baleful aura humanoid figure. Perhaps it would still be able to exist, but it would obviously have completely lost its autonomy and could only be controlled by the baleful aura. For him, such a result was almost equivalent to completely losing all hope. Perhaps in the next moment, the baleful aura would completely engulf him and use the method that was originally used to deal with Luo Fan on him. Obviously, the baleful aura humanoid figure, or rather, the willpower of the simulated state of chaos, could not accept such an outcome. At this moment, there was only a little bit left of the simulated state of chaos. That was the world of laws. Currently, in the entire simulated state of chaos, apart from the world of laws and the three-legged cauldron, everything else had been returned to its origin by the baleful aura. The three-legged cauldron was no longer in existence that could support the baleful aura humanoid figure. Now, the only thing that could support its willpower was the world of laws. The world of laws was created by Luo Fan. The way it was constructed was completely based on Luo Fan's worldview of laws. Such a world seemed to belong entirely to Luo Fan, and it shouldn't be of any help to the willpower of the simulated state of chaos. Unfortunately, the foundation of the world of laws from the very beginning was the simulated state of chaos. Back then, the reason why Luo Fan created the world of laws was because he was in the simulated state of chaos. Without the existence of the world of laws, he wouldn't even be able to think normally. At that time, the way he created the world of laws wasn't by directly materializing it from nothing, but by combining his worldview with the simulated state of chaos around him and transforming the simulated state of chaos. In this way, it was obvious that the foundation of the world of laws was still the simulated state of chaos. Naturally, it was still considered a part of the simulated state of chaos, and naturally, it could bear the consciousness of the simulated state of chaos. Even if the world of laws was under Luo Fan's absolute control, and the consciousness of the simulated state of chaos couldn't be manipulated to do anything, the nature of its foundation couldn't be changed. Therefore, at this time, even if only the world of laws and the three-legged cauldron that had nothing to do with the simulated state of chaos were left in the entire great calamity, the willpower of the baleful aura humanoid figure could still receive external support, and it was enough for it to continue to endure. Obviously, Luo Fan had also realized this. At this moment, he only smiled faintly. His clone didn't move much, but his main body had already started to take action. Destroying the world of laws to cut off the support obtained by the willpower of the simulated state of chaos was obviously the most straightforward and thorough method. But at the same time, it was also the most crude, the least technical, and the most mutually destructive method. For the willpower of the simulated state of chaos, the world of laws was the last remnant of the simulated state of chaos, and it was also the last external support it had. If it was destroyed, it would naturally be a great loss to it, and it might even sever all its hopes. However, at the same time, for Luo Fan, the significance of the law of heaven and earth was not small. One must know that even if he destroyed the willpower of the simulated state of chaos, it didn't mean that he had completely broken through this great calamity, nor did it mean that he had passed this great calamity. One must know that after the willpower of the simulated state of chaos lost its freedom, he still had the boundless source of baleful aura that he had to face. And the source of baleful aura could evolve into the boundless simulated state of chaos, the creator of the boundless world, and even the inconceivable existence of the boundless tribulations. With such an existence as his enemy, it went without saying how terrible the situation would be if he lost the world of laws. In other words, if the heaven and earth were to be destroyed for Luo Fan, it would be akin to harming the enemy while harming himself. Obviously, Luo Fan wouldn't choose such a method. Obviously, if it had been in the past, this contradiction would have been enough to make Luo Fan unable to think of anything else. In the end, he would have turned to a new option and could only obediently fight against the willpower of the simulated state of chaos that controlled the human form of the baleful aura. However, it was obviously not in the past. The three-legged cauldron's method was already the best example. The reason why the three-legged cauldron could return the fused power of the simulated state of chaos to its origin and turn it back into the source of the baleful aura was not only because of Luo Fan's will, but more importantly, the three-legged cauldron's essence was formed from the power related to the true sage. That power was related to a true divine. Its essence was so high that it far surpassed Luo Fan's great calamity, and it even surpassed the source of the evil aura in this great calamity. Because its essence was superior to the source of the baleful aura, it naturally had the possibility of completely suppressing the source of the baleful aura. Previously, in the three-legged round cauldron, the essence of the power related to the true divine was to turn a portion of the power and power back into the source of the evil chi. Then, it would suppress it bit by bit and refine it again and again. In the end, it would completely refine all the power and power. Although it seemed like only a short while had passed from the outside, due to the independent nature of time, Luo Fan's clone had spent trillions of years in order to complete the entire refinement process inside the three-legged round cauldron. Only then was he able to transform all the power and power inside the three-legged round cauldron into the baleful aura and completely refine it. Using the three-legged cauldron as an analogy, there was no longer any doubt as to how the world of laws should completely get rid of the essence of the simulated state of chaos. It could even be imagined that the process of the world of laws returning to its origin and refining might be even faster and more straightforward than the three-legged cauldron. Don't forget that the three-legged cauldron was only formed from a trace of the power related to the true sage. In the core of the world of laws, there was a complete strand of such power. In terms of quantity, the amount of power that had transformed into the three-legged cauldron was at most 1/billionth of the complete power. Such a huge disparity in quantity was enough to cause a huge disparity in the length of the refining process. In the end, perhaps the amount of time it would take would not be able to close the gap as great as the gap in strength, but the gap would definitely be incomparably huge. At this moment, the baleful aura humanoid figure controlled the boundless baleful aura to quickly leave the world of laws. Using the baleful aura to destroy the world of laws would only cause the world of laws to return to its origin and refine the baleful aura again, just like what had happened to the three-legged cauldron. Only by keeping the baleful aura as far away as possible from the world of laws, so that the world of laws couldn't obtain any baleful aura and allow everything in it to return to its origin, could it effectively delay the world of laws, return to its origin, and refine the baleful aura again. Of course, in the end, it could only delay the process. When the surroundings had completely transformed in a boundless baleful aura, it obviously couldn't stop the process no matter what. Even if the baleful aura humanoid figure could really prevent any baleful aura from entering the world of laws and affecting the world of laws, it couldn't stop the baleful aura from entering the world of laws. Chapter 2979. Changing the flow of time in a certain world where a certain space-time required authority over that world, and that space-time. Even if it wasn't the highest, it wasn't far from the highest. At the very least, one had to completely control that world, and that space-time. That was the case for the world, and that space-time. It was even more so for the source of the baleful aura, which was of a much higher level than this. Therefore, although the will that simulated the state of chaos had the ability to change the flow of time and even had the ability to travel between many space-time dimensions. However, compared to the baleful aura, these abilities were equivalent to an ant and an egg. The ant was indeed strong enough to lift items that were dozens or even hundreds of times heavier than its body, but it still couldn't handle the weight of an egg. Therefore, when the baleful aura figure discovered that it would take him tens of thousands of years to completely eliminate the pressure of the baleful aura, he knew that his fate was already completely in the hands of Luo Fan. If Luo Fan wasn't fast enough, it might even take him tens of thousands of years to return everything in the world of laws to its origin and refine it again. Then, he would be able to completely control the source of the baleful aura and finally complete the mission given to him by the Great Tribulation, which was to get rid of Luo Fan. If Luo Fan was faster, he would be able to return the world of laws to its origin and refine it again before he completed the entire mission. Then, what awaited him would be a fate that he would no longer be in control of. Worried, he didn't dare to delay any longer. All he could do was try his best to fuse with the baleful aura and eliminate the pressure that the baleful aura was exerting on his will. Compared to the various changes happening in the world of laws, The changes happening inside the baleful aura figure could be said to be extremely gentle and calm. At this moment, the entire world and the world of laws had already been turned upside down. All the worlds, all the parallel spaces, all the laws, all the matter, and all the energy began to riot at this moment. Wisps of baleful aura began to appear out of thin air and gradually occupied a larger and larger proportion of the world of laws. There were two sources of all these changes. The first was the core of the world. The second was the three-legged cauldron that hovered above the main body of the world like the sky of the main body of the world. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron was churning with malevolent energy. This kind of ominous aura was extremely mysterious, and its might was extremely terrifying. Although it was only surging within it, just its aura alone was sufficient to cause the entire world to return to its origin. At this moment, all the living beings in the world were horrified. They felt that the calamity this time had come so suddenly and so strangely. That's right, in the eyes of all living beings, this was another great tribulation of the world. After all, it was impossible for them to know that the simulated primal chaos outside the world of laws had vanished, and it was even more impossible for them to know who Luo Fan's current enemy was. To them, there was only one possibility for such a baleful aura to appear in every inch of space in this world at the same time to be caused by the great tribulation of the world. Regarding this baleful aura as a great tribulation of the world, all living beings were no longer at a loss. However, even though they were no longer at a loss, they clearly didn't have the ability to effectively prevent and eliminate such a calamity. For a moment, countless prayers surged towards Luo Fan. Luo Fan had left too many traces in the world of laws back then. Although a very, very long time had passed, his legend was still being passed down in this world. At this time, faced with this legendary great tribulation of the world, they naturally began to seek help from Luo Fan, who was said to have resolved the great tribulation of the world. In the face of such prayers, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. This tribulation that was similar to the great tribulation of the world was triggered by him. He needed to use this tribulation to achieve his own goal, so he naturally couldn't stop his plan just because of their prayers. Therefore, he could only ignore their prayers at this time. As their prayers were not answered, a stronger and stronger feeling of despair began to emerge among all living beings. Under such emotions, cursing, crying, begging, laughing, and so on, all sorts of ugly behaviors began to emerge. The negative emotions in the entire world started to rise gradually. Baleful aura itself was a source of energy for tribulations. Moreover, this was the source of baleful aura that triggered Luo Fan's seventh great tribulation and even gave rise to a boundless simulated state of chaos. Even though this baleful aura was triggered by Luo Fan for the sake of refining it completely, baleful aura was still baleful aura. The innate nature of this baleful aura would eventually trigger all sorts of corresponding changes in this world, triggering corresponding changes in all living beings in this world. A change that was like the descent of the great tribulation of the world. The surging negative emotions were brought about by such a change. From a certain perspective, the living beings in this world weren't wrong. They had indeed fallen into the great tribulation of the world. After all, everything that could happen in the great tribulation of the world would happen as the negative emotions of the living beings swarmed over. Luo Fan's state of mind rapidly stabilized. Although all of this was caused by him, if others were to speak ill of him and feel resentment towards him, no one would be in a good mood. Even Luo Fan felt the same way. Previously, when the living beings had constantly begged him to save them and help this world survive the tribulation, he had even felt a little guilty for causing all of this. However, this guilt had already disappeared without a trace as the living beings cursed, resented, and cried at him. After all, he was also a living being and had the common characteristics of living beings. Even if he had a firm will and an unshakable will like a boulder, he still couldn't completely avoid being affected, especially when he didn't try to suppress it. He instantly rejected the prayers of the countless living beings and focused on controlling the three-legged cauldron to continuously emit the influence of the source of baleful aura. He also controlled the entire world to return to its original state, turning everything in the world back into the baleful aura, assimilating them and refining them again. During this process, living beings were also within the scope of being dealt with. Living beings were also born from the world, so they naturally came from the simulated state of chaos. Of course, they also came from the source of the baleful aura. Returning to its original state naturally wouldn't miss out on these living beings. However, living beings were still somewhat different from other things. Although Luo Fan had his own objectives, he wasn't a cold-hearted person after all, and he still had some pity for the living beings. Even if the living beings were destined to perish along with the destruction of this great tribulation, he wasn't willing to watch them disappear completely when he could. Therefore, during the process of returning living beings to their original state, he did his best to preserve their consciousness. For ordinary cultivators, the consciousness of living beings and the essence of life were inseparable. Changing the essence of life would inevitably change one's consciousness. However, for Luo Fan, it was obvious that the two were completely different. The essence of life was the essence of life, and consciousness was consciousness. In most cases, consciousness and the essence of life were inseparable, and a change in the essence of life would inevitably bring about a corresponding change in consciousness. However, that was only in most cases. In a very small number of cases, the essence of life and consciousness were two completely different things. At this time, under Luo Fan's will in this world of laws, the situation of living beings was obviously an extremely small number of cases. At this time, according to his will, the essence of life of living beings returned to its original state and turned into baleful aura. Then, it was quickly refined by him, and a new structure that could withstand consciousness was established. Then, it took over the structure and turned into a living being's intelligence, continuing to survive in the baleful aura like before. Strictly speaking, these living beings were no longer considered living beings in the past. After all, the essence of life had changed. However, from another perspective, at least to these living beings themselves, and even to the living beings around them, they were still the original living beings. After all, their consciousness was still the original consciousness. After such a change, the difference between the living beings and the original living beings was rather subtle. Due to the change in their essence, the new consciousness they produced would obviously be quite different from the original consciousness of the essence of life. If their original consciousness did not exist, they would obviously become a completely different creature. They would no longer have anything to do with the original consciousness. However, because they still had the original consciousness, the newly produced consciousness would gradually fuse with the original consciousness. While affecting the original consciousness, it would also be assimilated by the original consciousness. The final result was that one day, a new living being would be born that was neither born from the original essence of life, nor would it be born from the later essence of life. Instead, it would be a new living being formed from the combination of the two. If those living beings had a choice, probably not many living beings would be willing to end up like this. However, this was clearly the limit of what Luo Fan could do. In the end, he still needed to return everything in this world of laws to its original state and refine it again. Those living beings were obviously also born from the source of baleful aura. If he let these living beings go and did not return them to their original state, it was obvious that this return to its original state would not be complete. Only the consciousness of living beings, which was invisible and intangible, was born from the essence of life. It was a wonderful existence that was formed from experience and was unique to all living beings. This was the only way to avoid the ending of returning to its original state. Otherwise, Luo Fan would not have been able to achieve such an outcome. Compared to completely obliterating their consciousness, the current situation was clearly many times better. In fact, if one were to think about it a little more, the changes they had undergone were equivalent to the changes in their living environment. Hence, their personalities had also unknowingly changed. If one thought about it this way, it did not seem so hard to accept. It was not easy to refine the baleful aura. Even though Luo Fan had already done it once in the three-legged cauldron, it was still extremely difficult to do it in this world of laws. It was not difficult to return everything to its original state and turn it back in a baleful aura. However, it was obviously extremely difficult to suppress the baleful aura and make it obediently be refined. Even though Luo Fan could use the power related to the true sage to greatly reduce the difficulty of this step, it was still extremely difficult to truly complete this refinement. At the very least, the speed at which he wanted to achieve this was not fast at all. As mentioned before, if one wanted to change the flow of time, one needed to have almost complete control over heaven and earth, the world, and space-time. Luo Fan should have been able to do this easily in this world of laws. After all, this world was completely created by him, and everything here was also cultivated by him. However, it was a pity that the flow of time in the world of laws wasn't completely free. In order to prevent the consciousness that simulated the state of chaos from prolonging the process of its collapse, the flow of time here had already been completely tied to the power related to the true sage. Therefore, the first thing to do to change the flow of time in this world of laws was to first change the flow of time of the power related to the true sage. Without changing the flow of time of the power, even Luo Fan would not be able to shake the flow of time in this world of laws in the slightest. Therefore, at this time, even if Luo Fan needed a large amount of time to return to its original state, he could not use his own control of the world to obtain a large amount of time. He could only obediently follow the original flow of time and try his best to speed up his actions to shorten the time needed for this process. So who's faster? Feeling the slow speed of the world of laws returning to its original state, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart. The current him was equivalent to competing with the consciousness that simulated the state of chaos. Whoever could complete the plan first would gain a huge advantage. Whoever was not fast enough would likely suffer a great loss or even fail completely in the end. Chapter 2980. Under Luo Fan's senses, time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had already passed. After 10,000 years, the appearance of the world had completely changed. The entire world seemed to be completely composed of murderous aura. Everything in the world, time, space, laws, and the mysteries of the great Tao had all turned into murderous aura. At this time, the despair and resentment that originally filled the world had already disappeared without a trace. Even if there was still a portion of the world in the deep layers that hadn't returned to its origin and turned in a murderous aura to be refined again, the living beings were clearly not part of that small minority. It could be said that the life essence of all the living beings in the entire world had been changed and their consciousness integrated into this life essence. In this way, they would naturally no longer be invaded and assimilated by the murderous aura. To them, the crisis had obviously passed completely. Since there was no crisis and their living environment was even safer than before, why would they still resent and despair? At the very least, the majority of living beings no longer had a reason to continue resenting and feeling despair. As for what a small minority of living beings thought, it was something that even Luo Fan couldn't change. Because of this, the entire world seemed extremely harmonious and peaceful. It was as if everything had been restored to its original state. On this day, the world of law's return to origin was already approaching a certain critical point. That location was none other than the core of this world of laws. Although this core was originally called the core, it wasn't much different from any other region of the world. It didn't have any extraordinary authority just because it was the core. If it had been the past, such a core would have returned to its origin, and it wouldn't have been much different from any other world or space-time that belonged to the world of laws. There wouldn't be any need for Luo Fan to treat it so cautiously. However, the current situation was no longer the same. The core of the world of laws naturally didn't have anything too special, and it didn't have any special authority over the world of laws. However, there were existences that Luo Fan couldn't afford to offend. Don't forget that the power related to the true divine was staying in the core space-time of this world. It was an extremely simple matter to return this core space-time to its original state, turn it into evil chi, and refine it again. However, no one could say for sure what kind of reaction this would cause to that force. Perhaps that force would completely ignore all these changes, allowing the core space-time to return to its original form, returning to its original form of evil chi, and then be refined by Luo Fan again to return to its original form? Or perhaps that power would directly freeze time and space, making it so that no matter how hard Luo Fan tried, he would not be able to return time and space to its original state, allowing it to return to the evil chi and be refined? Or perhaps that force didn't even stop Luo Fan's actions, but when space-time changed, it would directly leave and escape from this world. Wait. There were simply too many possibilities in that energy's reaction. What kind of response that force had would have a huge impact on Luo Fan's fate. Under such circumstances, how could he not be cautious? Hesitation was obviously not Luo Fan's style. Even if the way that force responded might have a huge impact on his fate, Luo Fan did not hesitate at this juncture. After being mentally prepared to deal with any changes, he directly pushed the process of returning to its original state into the core space-time. At this moment, the entire space-time began to emit evil chi. After the evil chi appeared, it began to connect with each other, gradually enveloping the space-time, transforming all the rules and laws, all the energy, all the matter, and all the information in it into the source of evil chi. At this moment, that force, which had not changed for an unknown period of time, suddenly trembled slightly and disappeared without a trace. The moment it disappeared, Luo Fan felt that his body was suddenly thrown out of thin air by that force. He was originally inextricably entangled with that force, and he even suspected that even if he survived this great tribulation, he might be entangled with it until the infinitely distant future. At this moment, those senses silently regained their freedom. Although his perception was still in the same state as when he was inside that power, outlining that incomparably complicated, mysterious, and profound structure, and still possessing all kinds of subtle and indescribable power, he was no longer restrained by anything. He could once again change into a state where he could freely change into any shape and structure as long as he wanted to. It left. At this moment, Luo Fan had a look of disbelief on his face. This situation seemed to be one of the few possibilities that he had guessed before, but it was obviously just on the surface. At this moment, that power hadn't just left the world of laws. If it was just a matter of leaving this world, then his true body would definitely leave and disappear from the core space-time of this world of laws. Even if it did not disappear, he would still have a subtle sense of that force. But at this moment, none of this happened. After that force disappeared, he had completely lost all sense of that force, and his true body still existed in the core space-time of this world of laws. With a thought, he turned his attention to his clone. At this moment, his clone had already lost its form. His clone, which couldn't be destroyed even with the inconceivable power of the will that simulated the state of chaos, had completely disappeared. Now, although his clone still existed, it had become illusory, as if only a sliver of consciousness was left. And above the world of laws, the three-legged cauldron that replaced the sky of this world had become much more illusory. It was as if its bones had been removed, and now only flesh and blood were left. All of this showed a fact, and that was that the force related to the true saint had completely disappeared. It didn't disappear from this world of laws, but completely disappeared from this great tribulation. So that's how it is. At this moment, Luo Fan still couldn't react. He only felt that this change was too sudden and unbelievable. However, after thinking about it carefully, such a development seemed to be reasonable. For the force related to the true saint, Its appearance in Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation was obviously just a natural change in the state of chaos. This was because Luo Fan had triggered the primal chaos state to descend upon his seventh great calamity. Then, in order to allow this seventh great calamity to take shape, the primal chaos state had attracted this power related to true divinity from an unknown place. In other words, this force didn't stay here willingly, but the state of chaos had no choice but to stay here. Under such circumstances, as long as the state of chaos no longer restricted it, then it was only natural for it to leave. After all, everything in the Great Calamity was of a very low level compared to this power. It was like a person curled up in an ant's nest. That kind of grievance and pain was needless to say. And looking at the current situation, this Great Tribulation had clearly come to an end. The suppression of the state of chaos on everything in the Great Tribulation had clearly weakened a lot, reaching a standard that could allow that force to transcend. Seeing that the force had disappeared, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. Naturally, he had countless thoughts about that power. In fact, he even had many plans to use that force to fight against the source of the ominous aura. Now that that power had suddenly disappeared without a trace, all of his thoughts and plans had come to naught. To a certain extent, this was a great loss to him. After sighing, he suddenly felt a lot more relaxed, as if a huge rock had been removed from his heart. Although this power was something that he could use, allowing him to achieve many goals that he could not achieve before, it was still something that he could not achieve before. It even became his backup plan, allowing him to protect the life of his real body even at the most dangerous moment. However, it was obvious that no matter how much this power related to true divine was beneficial to him or how much help it could give him, this power had come because of the Great Tribulation. It was there to serve the Great Tribulation. This was something that could not be changed. That force had always been indifferent to the Great Tribulation and even ignored the will that simulated the state of chaos, indirectly providing protection to Luo Fan. However, don't forget that the reason why the state of chaos had appeared in the beginning was because of this force. It was Luo Fan's luck that this force could maintain its personality under the restrictions of the Great Tribulation and completely ignore the Great Tribulation. However, who could guarantee that it could always maintain its personality? Who could guarantee that this force could always ignore the requirements of the Great Tribulation? Therefore, this force was undoubtedly a form of protection for Luo Fan, a force that could give him strength. However, at the same time, it was also a ticking time bomb that could blow him to pieces at any time. Now that the force related to the true sage had disappeared, it was a great loss for Luo Fan. But at the same time, it also eliminated a hidden danger that could erupt at any time. It was precisely because of this that he felt so complicated at this time. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan didn't have much time to continue feeling sentimental at this time. It must be said that there were too many things that he had constructed with that force as the core. Now that he had lost that force, those things obviously needed to be reconstructed to prevent them from collapsing. Just like his clone, just like the three-legged cauldron. At this time, his clone had already lost its body, and only a will was left. This was obvious proof. At this time, he first transferred his will to his clone. As the clone condensed, it quickly gathered the huge amount of source evil aura that had been completely refined by him. The source evil aura quickly gathered on its body, and its body regained the appearance of flesh and blood. Clearly, it had already used the source evil aura to reconstruct its clone. Although this clone was not as strong and sturdy as the clone that was condensed from the power related to the true sage, it was still much stronger than the body of flesh and blood that was condensed out of thin air. After this clone was formed, the original feeling that it could dissipate at any time disappeared without a trace. At this point, the reconstruction of the clone was obviously completed. The current clone was actually not much different from the human form formed by the fusion of the will and the source of the evil aura, which simulated the state of primal chaos. At most, there was a huge difference in the amount of source evil aura that was condensed. The clone that was formed with such a foundation could completely ignore the influence of the source evil aura on it. After this clone was formed, it didn't stay in the world of laws for long. In a flash, it had already stepped out of the world of laws and appeared outside the world of laws in the boundless evil aura. After arriving at this place and looking over, the gigantic baleful aura human silhouette was like the sea stabilizing divine needle within the boundless baleful aura. However, the outline of the divine sea steadying needle seemed a little blurry at this moment. Wisps of source evil aura were constantly dispersing from the body of the human form and continuously flowing into the boundless sea of source evil aura. Looks like you really can't hold on any longer, Luo Fan thought to himself. His figure flashed as he charged straight towards the human form. His clone was constructed from the source evil aura, so the boundless evil aura around him was like water to a fish. Not only did it not make him feel any pressure, but it even helped him constantly, allowing him to move forward more easily and happily than he usually did in the void. Soon, he arrived in front of the human form and collided with the source evil aura that was constantly dispersing. This evil aura was a mysterious existence that could simulate the state of chaos, and its complexity was even greater than that of the simulated state of chaos. This evil aura contained everything that was needed to form the world, as well as everything that was not needed to form the world. Within it, time and space, matter and energy, existence and non-existence were all in an extremely chaotic state. Chapter 2981. The source ominous energy that had been refined was clearly different from the source ominous energy that had not been refined. The moment Luo Fan stepped into the human-shaped sea of ominous energy, he confirmed this point. To Luo Fan's clone, the drifting source baleful aura that hadn't been refined by any existence was like water to a fish. Not only did it not cause any negative effects, but it also assisted and protected him in all aspects. However, the ominous energy within the human-shaped sea of ominous energy was completely different. The ominous energy that had dispersed was still fine. Perhaps it was because it had completely broken free from the will's control, or perhaps the dispersion itself was a return to its origin. Therefore, it did not have any negative effects on Luo Fan's clone at all, just like the ominous energy that was drifting around him. When Luo Fan's clone stepped into the human-shaped sea of ominous energy, he felt a pain that he had not felt in a long time. The endless source ominous energy seemed to have an irreconcilable grudge against him as it pounced towards Luo Fan's clone in a frenzy. Moreover, during this process, the source ominous energy continuously derived everything that living beings could imagine, including the simulated state of chaos, heaven and earth, the world, space-time, laws, cause and effect, fate, and all other tangible and intangible things. It was about to engulf Luo Fan's clone. The source ominous energy itself was a mysterious existence that could evolve and simulate the state of chaos, and the simulated state of chaos could evolve into heaven and earth, all living beings, and everything that living beings could imagine. It was very normal for such an existence to have such a transformation. As for the things that evolved, they were secondary derivations compared to the source ominous energy. They seemed to be a level lower than the source ominous energy, and when used in an attack, they seemed like flashy but impractical attacks. But, obviously, this is just a misconception. The difference in strength between secondary derivations and the original object could not be determined with a single cut. Some secondary derivations were clearly much weaker than the original source ominous energy. There was no doubt about this. However, some derivatives were countless times stronger than the original source ominous energy. Just like water power alone might be enough to destroy a mountain, or destroy a city, or even destroy a country. This was the limit of water power. However, if there was some technology that could convert it into electricity and then use the word electricity to drive some electric weapons, not to mention massacring cities and countries, even destroying planets or even universes and dimensions would not be a ridiculous thing. In terms of water power, electricity was obviously a secondary derivation of water power. Obviously, no one could say that electricity was inferior to water power. This was also the case for the source ominous energy. Although many things were derived from the source of the ominous aura, there were clearly far too many existences that were stronger than the source of the ominous aura in all aspects. Putting everything else aside, just the simulated state of chaos alone was far more complex than the source ominous energy in terms of attack. This was also the fundamental reason why the calamity had evolved the source ominous energy into a simulated state of chaos to test Luo Fan. If the simulated state of chaos did not have any advantage over the source ominous energy, why would the calamity go through the trouble of evolving it? At this moment, the source ominous energy was like an all-encompassing simulated state of chaos pouncing toward Luo Fan's clone. In the blink of an eye, it had completely enveloped the clone, causing the clone to once again fall into a simulated state of chaos. In front of him, there seemed to be endless darkness spreading out, and within it, there were billions and trillions of world creators appearing out of thin air, whether it was in the past or now. The change in front of him was not a problem for Luo Fan. In the past, with the power related to the true saint as the carrier of the clone, the simulated state of chaos could not truly pull him into it. As long as Luo Fan was willing to break free, he could easily break free by slightly activating the essence of the clone. After all, this was only a simulated state of chaos evolved from a little bit of the source ominous energy. The difference in quantity was too great, and it could not truly restrain even a trace of the power related to the true saint. And now, although the power related to the true saint had disappeared, the essence of Luo Fan's clone seemed to have been greatly reduced. However, after the power disappeared, what Luo Fan used to replace, it was the source ominous energy, the source of the simulated state of chaos. Although secondary derivatives were not necessarily inferior to the source ominous energy, it was obvious that secondary derivatives were ultimately derived from the source ominous energy. The relationship between a source object and a secondary derivative was still different from other things. In this place, the relationship between the source ominous energy and the simulated state of chaos was that the simulated state of chaos could not truly destroy the source ominous energy. When the simulated state of chaos came into contact with the source ominous energy, the best outcome would be to assimilate the source ominous energy and turn it into the simulated state of chaos. If the outcome was any worse, the simulated state of chaos would be transformed by the source ominous energy and turned back into the source ominous energy. And at this time, the boundless simulated state of chaos around him encountered the second situation. In just an instant, the portion of the simulated state of chaos that came into contact with Luo Fan had already collapsed, turning into wisps of source ominous energy that circled around his body. It continuously shattered the simulated state of chaos around him and turned it back into the source ominous energy. The simulated state of chaos was an existence that mixed up time and space. Looking at it from here, the simulated state of chaos seemed boundless, as if it could contain billions of worlds within it. However, if it was compared to the source ominous energy, its true size was undoubtedly on full display. At this time, when Luo Fan's clone returned the simulated state of chaos to its original form and turned it back into the source ominous energy, its true size was clearly displayed. The first wave of collapse and the source ominous energy's simulated state of chaos extended all the way to the outside of Luo Fan's field of vision. At a glance, it was as if the entire simulated primal chaos had completely collapsed and transformed into the source of baleful aura. It changed its form and pounced toward him, turning into tiny wisps of baleful aura that circled around his body. It felt as if an ant had slapped out and the entire universe had collapsed and perished. The scene was so grand that even the well-prepared Luo Fan could not help but be shocked. At this time, around the source ominous energy that had turned into a simulated state of chaos, endless source ominous energy continued to gather and surge into the simulated state of chaos. Then, it turned into a simulated state of chaos and continuously strengthened the seemingly tiny simulated state of chaos. The entire human-shaped sea of ominous energy was like a vortex that was getting bigger and bigger. Endless source ominous energy was constantly being sucked into this vortex and being sucked into it. At this time, in the eyes of Luo Fan's clone, the situation around him was that after the simulated state of chaos within his field of vision had turned back into ominous energy and nothingness, the simulated state of chaos on the outside was crazily surging in. At a speed visible to the naked eye, the simulated state of chaos that had turned back into the source ominous energy was rapidly filling up the void. It looked as if the simulated state of chaos had an incredible pressure on it. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. With a slight movement of his heart, the ominous aura surrounding his body slightly turned and rushed in all directions like a poisonous dragon. It directly penetrated the void and inserted itself into the infinite simulated chaotic state. It constantly returned to its original form, turned into the ominous aura, and fused into his body. As the source ominous energy moved, large areas of the simulated state of chaos were once again turned back into ominous energy and nothingness. As a result, the area of the nothingness increased. However, the extent of the increase was much smaller than before. Moreover, as time passed, it was still becoming smaller and smaller. It felt as if this method of returning the simulated state of chaos to its original form was becoming more and more difficult to achieve its effect. The source ominous energy is constantly being replenished. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan instantly made a judgment in his heart. This kind of behavior had to be said to be a foolish one. This was like adding oil to the fire. He clearly knew that the simulated state of chaos had no effect on the source ominous energy at all. It could only withstand the assimilation of the source ominous energy and be continuously returned to its original form, turning it back into the source ominous energy and becoming Luo Fan's power. Continuing to strengthen the simulated state of chaos was obviously sending itself to its doorstep. At most, it could only delay Luo Fan's probing, but it could not truly get rid of Luo Fan's clone. Is his goal just to delay me? With a thought, this idea surfaced in his mind. After fighting with the simulated state of chaos for so long, Luo Fan believed that he already had an extremely deep understanding of the consciousness. This deep understanding made him clearly know that if he could see clearly, the consciousness would definitely be able to see it clearly. If he could tell at a glance that this behavior was foolish, the consciousness would obviously be able to tell even faster. However, since the consciousness had already seen that this behavior could only achieve the effect of delaying his clone at most, but it still continued to do so, it was very easy for him to guess that the consciousness's goal was to delay his clone. This possibility was not small, but he still felt that something was wrong. With this mentality, his attacks became increasingly swift and fierce, and the speed at which he returned to the original form of the simulated state of chaos also became increasingly faster. At this moment, both Luo Fan and the consciousness were no longer able to control the source ominous energy's time. Needless to say, the consciousness had not completely fused with the source ominous energy and could not even control the source ominous energy, let alone control its time. As for Luo Fan, it could be said that he was much stronger than the will, but in reality, in terms of control over the ominous aura, he was much weaker than the will. After all, the source ominous energy had fused with the source ominous energy itself. Although it was not a complete fusion, it was still a complete fusion. What about Luo Fan? What he was doing now was refining and controlling the source of the murderous aura. This kind of refinement and control was already enough for his goal. However, in terms of connection with the source ominous energy, he clearly could not compare. In this way, he naturally could not do what the consciousness could not, which was control the source ominous energy's time. In this case, for now, They could only obediently follow the source ominous energies time dimension. It was as if they were in an ordinary world, crossing time after time and heading towards the future. Under such circumstances, although they could distort, cross, reverse, pause, and break time under normal circumstances, they were still like ordinary living beings in an ordinary world when it came to the deeper dimension of time. That kind of situation was naturally meaningless to the consciousness that was either in a simulated state of chaos or a clone that was formed with the source ominous energy as its foundation. Even if they twisted time into rings, even if they reversed time to billions of trillion years ago, the flow of time would not change for both of them. Even if all the changes were real, they would still be like illusions to each other. It was precisely because of this that at this moment, neither of them bothered with time. They just behaved as if they didn't have the ability to control time. They obeyed the time dimension of the source of the baleful aura and fought each other honestly. Manipulating illusions was completely meaningless to them. At most, it would only divert their attention and interfere with their willpower. Instead, it would make them unable to wholeheartedly display their reality and their full strength. This was clearly an action that did not make up for the losses. Time passed bit by bit as they sensed it. Before they knew it, several years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly frowned and suddenly started to retreat rapidly. He wanted to leave the simulated state of chaos that had expanded tens of thousands of times. Chapter 2982. At this moment, Luo Fan finally knew that his intuition over the past few days had been correct. The will that simulated the state of chaos was indeed not simply stalling for time. He indeed had an inexplicable plan. If there were no surprises, this plan was to take over the new simulated state of chaos. That's right. The will that simulated the primal chaos state was planning to take over this new simulated primal chaos state and replace the will of the new simulated primal chaos state, becoming the new simulated primal chaos state's will. By relying on this new, simulated state of chaos, the will in the murderous aura human form was able to obtain external support, thereby alleviating the pressure from the murderous aura and finally giving it enough time to completely integrate with the source of the murderous aura. Now, he had clearly completed the first step of his plan. At this moment, the fact that he could converse with Luo Fan in this simulated state of chaos meant that he had already begun to take over the new simulated state of chaos. In the face of such a will, Luo Fan's clone did not choose to reply. Instead, he manipulated the murderous aura in his body to transform it into a giant axe and ruthlessly cleaved at the endless simulated state of chaos behind him. Although the source of evil chi had transformed into a giant axe, it was only in the form of a giant axe. In essence, it was still the source of evil chi. It was still the source of evil chi. It went without saying that such an existence would have a huge impact on the simulated state of chaos when it cleaved down. At this moment, the simulated state of chaos under the axe completely shattered and transformed back into the source of the murderous aura, which continued to advance along the axe's trajectory. It felt as easy as cutting butter with a knife. As the axe moved, Luo Fan's body rapidly moved along with it. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed an unknown distance. Space had disappeared without a trace. This new, simulated state of chaos clearly did not appear out of thin air. Evidently, with the will's ability to control the murderous aura, it was impossible for him to turn the murderous aura into a chaotic state other than the origin of the murderous aura that was under his complete control. However, if he were to simulate a chaotic state within the source of ominous chi that he had complete control over, it would be meaningless to him. After all, the source of ominous chi had already been completely fused with him, and its very existence was enough to support his will. For such an existence to evolve into a simulated chaotic state, other than changing the form of its support, what other difference was there? Only the origin baleful chi, which had yet to be completely fused with him, would be able to evolve into a simulated primal chaos state. Only then would he be able to sustain himself for a longer period of time. This was obviously a contradiction. He could control the evolved parts, but there was no point in evolving them. He had evolved the source of baleful energy that was meaningful to him, but he was completely unable to control it. In that case, it was obvious what the will would do. Of course, it was to bring in an enemy that could make the source baleful chi transform into a chaotic state on its own. This way, the source baleful chi would transform into a chaotic state even without his complete control. Evidently, Luo Fan's doppelganger was the enemy he had let in. Over the past few days, it seemed as if Luo Fan had been continuously refining the source of ominous chi and disintegrating the attacks of the human-shaped sea of ominous chi. However, during this process, he was actually being used by the will. He was being used as a primer for the source of ominous chi to evolve into a simulated chaotic state. Relying on this primer, the will would be able to obtain a new simulated chaotic state. Only then would it be able to completely possess the simulated chaotic state and turn this new simulated chaotic state into an external force that was supported by its will. When he thought of this, Luo Fan naturally understood that what he needed to do now was to leave this simulated chaotic state and the human-shaped sea of ominous chi. No matter what the will wanted to express, no matter what benefits it wanted to give him, leaving this human-shaped sea of ominous chi and letting the simulated chaotic state become water without a source or a tree without roots was not wrong. At this moment, a huge palm appeared out of thin air in front of the axe. This palm was not the source of ominous chi, nor was it purely a simulated chaotic state. Instead, it had evolved into the shape of an unknown number of worlds. The cells of an unknown number of worlds gathered together to form a huge palm. This palm seemed illusory and real at the same time. It was faintly discernible, but its power was absolutely real. From a perspective of the simulated chaotic state, this was a simulated chaotic state layer. A simulated chaotic state layer that was in the shape of a palm and possessed unimaginable power. After this huge palm appeared, it changed slightly and formed countless hand seals. The entire power of the simulated chaotic state seemed to be mobilized in an instant and gathered towards the palm. Countless strange lights formed on the surface of the palm, and mottled light blocked the source of ominous chi in the form of a giant axe in Luo Fan's hand. The two collided. In just an instant, countless worlds fell into an indescribable tribulation. Under the corrosion of the tribulation, they rapidly collapsed and died. It looked like the axe had slashed straight into the palm and was continuously breaking it apart. However, at this moment, the simulated chaotic state behind the palm surged. Countless worlds rapidly formed and continuously surged into the palm, replenishing the damage caused by the giant axe. From a macroscopic perspective, the wound on the palm was healing at an unimaginable speed. The countless mottled lights continuously gathered towards the giant axe and frantically twisted the material of the axe. This caused the source of the ominous chi that formed the axe to be continuously attacked and disintegrated. It then continuously evolved into all kinds of strange existences, such as simulated chaotic state, heaven and earth, world, time and space, matter and energy, laws and laws, and even pure nothingness. As this happened, the giant axe felt like it was enduring an indescribable corrosion. Its surface gradually became mottled, and more damaged parts appeared on the giant axe. In the face of this change, Luo Fan's expression did not change much. It was extremely normal for the will to prevent him from leaving. The method he used at this moment seemed terrifying, but it was actually just that. With a thought, the wisps of the source of ominous chi on the surface of the giant axe began to transform. In the end, they turned into countless indescribable dimensions and directly wrapped around the palm. During this process, the palm was divided into countless layers of attributes and absorbed into the countless dimensions. It was the same for those mottled lights. There were no different layers in this source of ominous chi. It was one, but was also 10,000. Its own existence already contained everything that could and could not be thought of, including the simulated chaotic state and the countless layers. Therefore, the method of using the power of other layers to divide the real world clearly could not be used here. However, although it could not be used here directly, the characteristic of the source of ominous chi that was 1 was also 10,000 was obviously of great help and could effectively make up for this deficiency. For example, the source of ominous chi used itself to develop the power needed to divide the dimensions. It used itself to replace the effects of the countless layers and easily divided the palm formed by the countless worlds into countless dimensions, completely dividing the attributes of the countless layers. At this time, if Luo Fan wanted to, he only needed to destroy the palm in the multiverse, and he would be able to completely erase the entire palm. However, at this point, he did not continue. Instead, he did not even care about the giant palm. As if passing through an illusion, he passed through the place where the palm was and continued forward, heading out of the simulated chaotic state. At this moment, the wolf finally spoke again. "Stop!" A huge sound wave in the simulated chaotic state turned into countless worlds. Like a surging wave, it appeared out of thin air in front of him and pounced towards Luo Fan. Following this sound wave was a huge face of order creation and destruction. This face of order creation and destruction was not much different from the one Luo Fan had seen in the previous chaotic state. However, compared to the previous one, this face of order creation and destruction was obviously much smaller. Its appearance instantly caused a large area of simulated chaos in the surroundings to collapse completely and turn into order. Then, it was destroyed and perished from the order. Shortly after, another order was born, and it was destroyed and perished again. Just like that, the cycle repeated endlessly. The range of order creation and destruction kept spreading outwards, as if it was going to expand to the entire simulated chaotic state. However, when it spread to the boundary of Luo Fan's perception range, it stopped, as if there was an unbelievable power there that stopped the spread of order creation and destruction. Seems like you've learned your lesson. Although Luo Fan said that, he didn't stop his movements. He brandished the axe in his hand, and as if he was splitting the heavens and earth apart, it circled around an incomparably mysterious, abstruse, and profound trajectory, and directly embedded itself into the center of the order face of life and death. It ruthlessly and mercilessly split the order face of life and death into two. The endless source of ominous aura was constantly evolving during this process, and was devoured by the giant axe, transforming into the giant axe and strengthening it. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan's figure had already crossed the order life and death face and arrived at the range of the order life and death face. After arriving there, another face of order creation and destruction appeared in front of him. You can't get out. No matter which direction you go, the ominous aura will only gather and evolve in that direction. The face of order creation and destruction said without much fear. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "In that case, am I not doing you a favor by doing this? Why do you have to stop me?" As he spoke, his movements didn't stop at all. The axe once again drew a mysterious trajectory and easily split open the face of order creation and destruction, forming a void. Then, he penetrated the void and continued moving forward. Following that, another face of order creation and destruction appeared in front of him and continued to say, "I just want the evolution of the ominous aura to be more convenient for me." Before it finished its sentence, it was split open by the axe, and the place where it was located turned into nothingness. Perhaps. Luo Fan's expression didn't change much at this time as he said so. As he spoke, his body actually sped up even further. Just like that, one after another, the faces of order creation and destruction appeared in front of him, constantly using various ways to express that it was meaningless for him to do so. If this continued, it would only bring trouble to both sides, and he would never achieve his desired goal. Facing such a face of order creation and destruction, Luo Fan spoke and destroyed it without holding back. His figure kept moving forward, getting closer and closer to the place he wanted to reach. At a certain moment, An enormous figure of order creation and destruction appeared in front of him. This order life and death humanoid was dozens of times larger than the order life and death humanoid that had appeared countless times before. After appearing at this moment, it wasn't even willing to talk to Luo Fan anymore. It clenched its fist and blasted at Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, the simulated chaotic state naturally evolved into thousands of wonderful forms, transforming into an unknown number of trillions of inconceivable attacks that fiercely smashed down towards Luo Fan's axe. Kacha! The massive sound waves impacted the surrounding order creation and destruction area, causing it to collapse completely. Everything quickly turned into nothingness. In the end, the area around Luo Fan and the figure of order creation and destruction was empty. At this moment, Luo Fan said calmly, "Didn't I say it's useless? Why are you stopping me?" You can actually tell the direction. The figure of order creation and destruction said in an inexplicably complicated tone. Chapter 2983. In the face of such a fist, Luo Fan remained unfazed. Even though the power of this fist alone was enough to destroy billions of worlds and turn everything into a simulated state of primal chaos, the power of this fist was enough to destroy billions of worlds. However, its essence was ultimately formed from the birth and destruction of order. The foundation of such an existence was the simulated chaos, and the foundation of the simulated chaos was the source of the inauspicious aura. In this way, its weakness could be said to be completely in the hands of Luo Fan, who had already grasped a portion of the source of the inauspicious aura. Although the scale of the attack before him was extremely grand, it was ultimately unable to break through the shackles, and its essence did not change much. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan, who was facing this punch, only slightly swung the giant axe in his hand, and it had already transformed into an unknown number of axes, directly embedding itself into the punch that was capable of destroying an unknown number of trillions of worlds. As the countless axes pierced into the fist, it was as if the fist was being cut by thousands of knives. It shattered layer by layer, and the skin, muscles, bones, marrow, in the blink of an eye, it had completely turned into nothingness. An incredible shock wave spread endlessly in all directions, causing the nothingness to grow larger and larger, and turning more and more of the simulated chaos into the source of the inauspicious aura. As the shock wave spread, it was continuously eliminated by the simulated chaos. The more one thought about it, the smaller the magnitude of the shock wave. After spreading for an unknown amount of time, it completely disappeared and could no longer be seen. At least, that was the case in most directions. Apart from the direction that Luo Fan was facing, which was the direction that he had always been charging forward in. At this moment, the shock wave did not spread for long before a hole opened up in that direction. It was a hole that led to a completely different but familiar place. It was none other than the endless source of the inauspicious aura outside of the simulated chaos. Evidently, the hole had completely broken the simulated chaos, allowing Luo Fan to finally break free from the simulated chaos. At this moment, the endless simulated chaos in the surroundings began to move towards the central nothingness. As it shrank with all its might, it wanted to fill up the central nothingness completely and cover up the hole again. At this rate, it wouldn't be long before the hole was completely healed and could no longer be seen. However, it was very obvious that Luo Fan had painstakingly made such a hole. So how could he just watch it disappear and heal? At this moment, he rushed towards the hole without hesitation. Along the way, his origin malevolent axe was extremely useful. Against all the derivatives that simulated the state of chaos that attacked him, he destroyed as many as he touched them. Along the way, he left behind countless fragments of heaven and earth, fragments of worlds, fragments of space-time, corpses of living creatures, fragments of laws. All obstructions had no effect in front of the origin baleful aura axe, allowing Luo Fan to easily rush through the large expanse of nothingness and crash into the hole, completely breaking away from this new simulated state of chaos. Looking back, he found that he was already outside the sea of baleful auras. From the outside, the simulated chaos looked like a strange gray smoke that covered the entire sea of malevolent aura, turning the entire malevolent aura human form from its original appearance into a gray haze. It looked as if its original body of flesh and blood had turned into a stone statue. Evidently, in the past few years, with the help of Luo Fan's pressure, the simulated state of chaos had evolved to a certain limit. At this moment, it had completely enveloped his entire body. In other words, it had replaced his entire body of baleful auras. Such a method could not be said to be unwise. Even though Luo Fan had already guessed it, he couldn't help but be amazed when he saw it with his own eyes. After all, he knew that if he had fallen into the situation of the simulated state of chaos, he might not have been able to think of such a method to escape. At this moment, although the willpower had yet to fully refine the new willpower that simulated the chaotic state, there was no way for it to maintain this simulated chaotic state. However, at the very least, the simulated state of chaos in front of him was enough to make up for the loss of the world of laws. It was enough to buy him a longer time to integrate with the source baleful aura. At this moment, the eyes of the baleful auras, or rather, the simulated state of chaos, suddenly opened. With a pull of its hands, a spear made of baleful auras appeared out of thin air between its hands. "Since you're unwilling to cooperate, then disappear forever," said the humanoid figure. Amidst these words, the spear flashed and arrived in front of Luo Fan. It was about to pierce his heart and completely erase his body. In the face of such a spear, Luo Fan could only retreat. He also had the giant axe formed from the source baleful aura in his hand. In terms of material quality, the giant axe was naturally not inferior to the spear made of baleful auras. In fact, because he had condensed it for a long time, the nature of the giant axe was even stronger than the spear made of baleful auras. However, the amount of baleful aura condensed by the giant axe was far inferior to the amount of baleful auras condensed by the spear. If the amount of baleful auras condensed by the giant axe was 1, then the amount of baleful auras condensed by the spear would be millions or even tens of millions. Such a huge gap was like a person holding a handful of iron sand and a powerhouse holding a mountain against his enemy. Purely in terms of weapons, failure was inevitable. Therefore, he had no choice but to retreat at this time. The attack of the humanoid figure was clearly not at the level of an ordinary mortal. Of course, the spear wasn't just a simple spear. After this spear, the complexity of the changes was absolutely beyond the imagination of all living beings. When the spear missed, the spear instantly gave rise to trillions of changes, sealing off all directions of Luo Fan, and even every dimension and possibility. It crushed towards Luo Fan's clone from all directions. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan's performance wasn't too bad. At this moment, a thought flashed through his mind, and his movements didn't stop. The giant axe in his hand continued to dance and change, and his figure also constantly shifted. It was as if he had compressed billions of possibilities into one in an instant and made billions of completely different responses at the same time. In the end, it was still Luo Fanchi who came out on top. Among the hundreds of millions of possibilities, there were still a few that surpassed the limits of the fiendish humanoid figure, or the will that simulated the state of primal chaos. For Luo Fan, there was only one possibility that could allow him to escape, which meant that he would be able to do so. With his ability, it couldn't be any easier to expand that possibility to the entire situation. Therefore, in the end, in an almost impossible situation, his figure directly stepped out of the range of the long spear's range. He escaped in an extremely strange, coincidental, and mysterious way. At this moment, the humanoid figure clearly had no intention of stopping. The spear changed again, and in an instant, it turned into a giant net that covered the sky and the earth, completely enveloping Luo Fan from all directions. The giant net was so dense that it felt as if even the slightest thing would not be able to pass through the holes in the net. Strictly speaking, it couldn't even be called a net, but a barrier. It was a spherical shape that sealed off all directions around Luo Fan. In the face of such a giant net, Luo Fan's clone sighed. The giant axe in his hand instantly collapsed, turning back into the origin evil chi, and began to dissipate in all directions. As the origin evil chi dissipated, it naturally began to evolve. In the end, it turned into billions of dimensions that continuously expanded in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already completely enveloped the giant barrier. It continuously divided the barrier, turning it into endless layers of attributes in the blink of an eye. As the barrier was divided into countless layers of attributes and absorbed into the countless dimensions, the original restraining effect naturally disappeared without a trace. In a flash, Luo Fan's figure had already left the barrier without any obstruction and appeared outside it. After arriving here, Luo Fan didn't have the slightest intention of stopping. With a turn of his body instantly collapsed and turned into a whirlpool of source evil chi. He began to stir the source evil chi in a wider and wider range, causing the endless evil chi to continuously gather towards his location. The origin evil chi that had gathered since ancient times was naturally different from the origin evil chi that his clone had completely refined. The murderous aura that his doppelganger had refined was under his absolute control. He could transform the murderous aura into anything he wanted. The fact that he could transform it into a physical body was the best proof of this. Transforming something into a body was obviously more troublesome than transforming it into something else. If he could do this, then he would naturally have no problem doing anything else. However, the origin evil chi that had gathered was different. As for the origin evil chi that had gathered, Luo Fan could not completely control it. At most, he could only make the origin evil chi treat him as one of its kind and not harm him. Directly controlling the origin evil chi? Don't even think about it. However, although he could not directly control it, it was still possible to indirectly control it. Just like an ordinary person, he clearly did not have the ability to directly control fire. However, through various instruments, he could use fire to cook, use fire to process materials, use fire to keep warm, use fire to destroy enemies. It was the same for the origin evil chi. At this time, Luo Fan used the small portion of the origin evil chi that his clone had fused with to continuously permeate it into the origin evil chi around him. He began to pry open the origin evil chi that was not directly under his control and did his best to guide the origin evil chi to evolve according to his will. Under his guidance, the vortex gradually changed, and the many trajectories formed by the origin evil chi became more and more mysterious and profound. Unknowingly, it even faintly conformed to some indescribable law, a law that was incomparably familiar to both Luo Fan and the will that simulated the state of chaos. It was a law that belonged to the will of heaven and earth. As this strange structure took shape, an indescribable will began to emerge from the vortex. This was like a blank piece of paper, as if it did not know anything. However, as soon as it appeared, it began to absorb the endless origin evil chi around it to strengthen itself. As the vortex grew larger and larger, it became more and more terrifying. In the end, it even affected the baleful aura around the source of the baleful aura, causing the baleful aura to be pulled out involuntarily, turning into threads that gathered towards the whirlpool. This change made the expression of the origin evil chi human figure change drastically, and it could not help but retreat. "How did you do it?" exclaimed the origin evil chi human figure. This exclamation was transmitted into Luo Fan's ears. At this time, Luo Fan was in no mood to answer its question. At this time, he was doing his best to control the origin evil chi that his clone had fused with. Through the stirring of the origin evil chi, he was doing his best to guide the surrounding origin evil chi to gather into the form of a vortex, allowing it to naturally give birth to a blank consciousness. In fact, the appearance of this vortex was indeed the appearance of a vortex formed by the will of the world. As for why Luo Fan was able to condense such a vortex, the reason was very simple. It was because he had already obtained the memories of the predecessor of the will of the world. As the memories of the predecessor of the will of the world, the condensation of this vortex was almost instinctive. He was extremely clear about the structure of the vortex, and he had absolute control over every single detail within it. It was not at all strange for Luo Fan, who had obtained so many memories, to be able to condense such a vortex. Of course, the difficulty wasn't in how to condense such a vortex, but rather how to make the origin evil chi exist stably in such a vortex structure. After all, compared to the origin evil chi in the vortex, the origin evil chi that he could control was like a drop of water compared to the ocean. It went without saying how difficult it was to rely on a drop of water to control the operation of the entire ocean and turn the entire ocean into a vortex. In fact, if it were not for Luo Fan's brilliant methods, this would have been an impossible task.